The day Cole Maddox broke through solid rock at 60 feet, he didn't find water. He found salvation. But that came later. First came the dust, the death, and a stranger who claimed she could read the earth like a book. In the summer of 1878, Red Hollow Valley was dying, and one man's desperate gamble would either save an entire community or bury them all in debt and broken dreams. This is a story of drought, desperation, and the dangerous choice between surrender and survival. Stay with me until the end, hit that like button, and comment what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let me take you back to when the West was won not by guns, but by water. The heat came early that year, settling over Red Hollow Valley like a predator crouching on wounded prey. By mid-June, the sun had bleached the grass to the color of old bone, and by July, even the hardiest scrub oak had begun dropping leaves in a desperate bid for survival. Cole Maddox stood on the porch of his ranch house, squinting across land that had belonged to his family for 2 generations, and saw nothing but dying cattle and broken promises. 37 head down in 3 weeks. The numbers ran through his mind like a funeral procession, each lost animal a nail in the coffin of everything his father and grandfather had built. The water holes that had sustained the Maddox Ranch through 20 seasons had become nothing more than cracked mud and the skeletal remains of hope. "We could sell the North Pasture," his brother Thomas said from behind him, voice tight with the kind of desperation that made men do foolish things. "The Hendersons might still buy, even in this market." Cole didn't turn around. "That's the best grazing land we have. Without it, the ranch is worth nothing anyway. At least we'd have cash, enough to get through the year, maybe relocate to—" "I'm not selling." The words came out harder than Cole intended, edged with the exhaustion of too many sleepless nights and too many impossible decisions. "And I'm not relocating. This is our land, Thomas. Our blood is in this soil." Blood doesn't pay the bank. Thomas moved to stand beside him, and Cole could see his younger brother had aged a decade in the past 3 months. At 28, Thomas still had the lean, restless energy of youth, but his eyes had gone hollow. "The notice came yesterday. We have until September 1st, or they take everything." 6 weeks. 42 days to save a legacy that had taken 60 years to build. Cole's hand tightened on the porch rail, the wood rough and sun-warmed beneath his calloused palm. He was 32 years old, unmarried, and had spent every day of his adult life working this land. The idea of walking away, of watching strangers claim the valleys where his father had taught him to ride, where his grandfather had fought off Comanche raiders and built the original cabin, it was unthinkable. It was unbearable. And yet the drought didn't care about legacy. The cracked earth didn't honor blood ties or the sweat of honest labor. Nature was indifferent to human desperation, and that indifference was killing them all. "I'm going into town," Cole said finally. "See if I can talk to Garrison at the bank, buy us some more time." Thomas laughed, a bitter sound. "Garrison's been foreclosing on half the valley. What makes you think he'll make an exception for us?" "Because I'm going to make him understand that this drought will break. It has to break. Nothing lasts forever, not even this." But even as he said the words, Cole wondered if he believed them. Red Hollow was dying. Cole could see it the moment he rode down Main Street on his bay mare, Copper. Half the storefronts that had been thriving a year ago now stood empty, their windows dark and dusty. The general store was still open, but Old Man Pritchard sat on a barrel outside, staring at nothing with the glazed expression of someone who'd already given up. The saloon was unusually crowded for a Thursday afternoon, full of men with nowhere else to go and nothing left to do but drink away their failures. Cole recognized most of them, ranchers and farmers who'd built lives here, who'd believed in the promise of the frontier. Now they were ghosts haunting their own memories, watching their dreams turn to dust. "Cole Maddox." The voice came from his left, and Cole turned to see James Hendricks approaching, his weathered face creased with concern. "Heard you lost another 12 head last week." 15. Cole dismounted, tying Copper to the hitching post. "You?" 23. Hendricks spat into the dirt, the gesture more habit than necessity. There was no moisture left to spare. "I'm pulling out end of the month, taking what's left of my family to California. Got a cousin in Sacramento says there's work in the lumber camps." The words hit Cole harder than he expected. Hendricks had been in Red Hollow almost as long as the Maddox family. His spread bordered theirs to the east, and Cole had grown up playing with Hendricks' sons, learning to rope and brand alongside them. California's a long way to go on hope, Cole said carefully. So's staying here on pride. Hendricks met his eyes, and there was no judgment in his gaze, only a bone-deep weariness. I know what you're thinking, Cole. I thought the same thing. That I was a Hendricks, that my daddy built this ranch from nothing, that running was the same as surrender. But there comes a time when you have to choose between your legacy and your life. I've got 4 children and a wife who's lost 20 pounds she didn't have to lose. Pride won't feed them. Cole had no answer for that. He watched Hendricks walk away, shoulders bent under the weight of defeat, and felt something cold settle in his chest. How many others were making the same calculation? How long before he and Thomas were the last ones left, stubbornly clinging to worthless land while the world moved on? The bank sat at the corner of Main and 3rd, a solid brick building that had been constructed to project permanence and prosperity. Now it felt more like a fortress, its thick walls and barred windows a reminder that Franklin Garrison held the fate of the valley in his ledgers and lockboxes. Cole pushed through the door, and the interior was blessedly cool after the furnace heat outside. Margaret Dawson, Garrison's secretary, looked up from her desk with a sympathetic smile that told Cole she already knew why he was there. "He's expecting you," she said quietly. "3rd door on the left." The fact that Garrison was expecting him wasn't encouraging. It meant the banker had been tracking the Maddox situation, tallying up the numbers, and preparing for this conversation. Cole knocked once and entered without waiting for permission. Franklin Garrison was 54 years old, gray-haired and impeccably dressed, even in the midst of a catastrophe. He sat behind a massive oak desk that had been shipped from Chicago at God knew what expense, the picture of Eastern refinement transplanted to the harsh frontier. When he looked up at Cole, his expression was professionally neutral. "Mr. Maddox, please, sit down." Cole remained standing. "I'm here about the foreclosure notice." "Yes, I assumed as much." Garrison leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "I'm afraid there's not much to discuss. The terms were clear when your father took the loan 7 years ago. The payment schedule, the interest rate, the consequences of default, all spelled out in black and white." "My father's dead," Cole said flatly. "And when he took that loan, the valley had water. Circumstances have changed." "Circumstances always change, Mr. Maddox. That's precisely why we have contracts, to provide stability regardless of circumstances. The bank cannot make exceptions based on weather patterns, no matter how sympathetic we might be to individual hardships." Cole felt his jaw tighten. "You're foreclosing on half the valley. When everyone's gone and you're sitting on 1,000 acres of worthless dust, what exactly do you think you'll have won?" For the first time, something flickered across Garrison's face. Not sympathy exactly, but a kind of weary resignation. "I don't make the rules, Mr. Maddox. I simply enforce them. The bank in Denver has its own obligations, its own investors to answer to. If I show favoritism, if I allow emotions to override business judgment, we all lose. The entire system collapses." "The system's already collapsed. Look around. Red Hollow is dying." "Yes," Garrison agreed quietly. "It is. And that's a tragedy. But it's not the bank's responsibility to fight nature. We're not in the miracle business." Cole wanted to argue further, to rage against the cold logic that reduced human lives to numbers on a balance sheet. But he'd known before he walked in here that it was pointless. Garrison was right about one thing. The terms had been clear. His father had borrowed money to expand the ranch during good times, betting on continued prosperity, and now the debt had come due during the worst drought anyone could remember. "I need more time," Cole said finally, hearing the edge of desperation in his own voice and hating it. "Just until winter, if the rains come. And if they don't?" Garrison shook his head. "I've given you 3 extensions already, Mr. Maddox. Each time you've promised the situation would improve. Each time it's gotten worse. I'm sorry, but September 1st is final. If you cannot make the payment by then, the property will be seized and auctioned." Cole stared at the man across the desk, seeing no malice there, no cruelty, just the inexorable grinding of a machine that cared nothing for individual suffering. In that moment, he understood with perfect clarity that this fight could not be won with words or appeals to mercy. If he was going to save the ranch, it would have to be through action, through finding some solution that Garrison and his ledgers and his distant investors couldn't foresee. He turned and left without another word. The saloon was calling to him, its dark interior and cheap whiskey promising at least a temporary escape from the weight pressing down on his shoulders. Cole stood outside for a long moment, Copper's reins in his hand, wrestling with the temptation. It would be so easy to walk in there, to join Hendricks and the others in drinking away the afternoon, to pretend for a few hours that none of this was happening. Instead, he mounted up and rode out of town, heading not home, but toward the western ridge that overlooked the valley. It was a place he'd come since boyhood, whenever he needed to think or simply to remember why this land mattered. The ride took 40 minutes, and by the time he reached the overlook, the sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon. From up here, he could see the entire sweep of Red Hollow Valley, the dried creek beds like scars across the landscape, the clusters of buildings that marked the scattered ranches, the town itself small and vulnerable against the vastness of the plains. His grandfather had stood in this exact spot 60 years ago, according to family legend, and decided this was where he would build a life. It hadn't been easy then either. Comanche territory, no law for 200 miles, winters that could kill an unprepared man in a single night. But Samuel Maddox had been stubborn, visionary, and brave enough to bet everything on a wild dream. Cole wondered what his grandfather would think of him now, of the choice he was facing. Would the old man see his refusal to sell as strength or foolishness? Was there honor in fighting a battle that couldn't be won, or was the real courage in knowing when to walk away? He sat there on the ridge as the sun painted the sky in shades of amber and crimson, and for the first time in months, he allowed himself to truly consider the possibility of failure. What would it mean to lose the ranch? Where would he go? What would he become without this identity that had defined him since birth? The questions spiraled through his mind, each one darker than the last, until he forced himself to stop. Dwelling on defeat wouldn't save anything. He needed solutions, not despair. The problem was simple enough. No water meant no cattle, and no cattle meant no money. Even if the drought broke tomorrow, it would take months for the grazing land to recover, months more to rebuild the herd. The bank wouldn't wait that long. He needed water now, immediately, in quantities large enough to sustain what remained of his livestock and give him something to sell before September 1st. But where could he find water that didn't depend on rainfall? The wells they'd dug were running dry, along with every other surface source in the valley. Short of drilling down to bedrock and hoping to hit a miracle, Cole stopped, that half-formed thought catching in his mind. Drilling, deep wells. He'd heard stories of ranchers in other territories going down 50, 60, even 100 feet to find underground springs. It was expensive, dangerous work that often ended in failure, but when it succeeded, it could transform everything. He turned the idea over, examining it from every angle. He had no money to hire professional well diggers, even if he could find any willing to come to a dying valley. The equipment alone would cost more than he could raise. But what if he did it himself? What if he and Thomas put everything they had into one desperate gamble, dig until they found water, or hit stone too hard to break through? It was insane. It was reckless. It was probably suicide, but it was the only option he could see that didn't end in surrender. Cole sat on that ridge until full darkness fell, and the stars emerged like distant witnesses to his decision. Then he mounted Copper and rode home, a plan forming in his mind that was equal parts desperation and determination. What? Thomas was waiting on the porch when Cole arrived, and from the tension in his younger brother's posture, Cole knew something else had gone wrong. "What now?" he asked, dismounting. "The Miller place." Thomas's voice was rough. "They lost their whole herd. Every last head. Ben Miller found them this morning, collapsed around a dry water hole." Cole closed his eyes briefly. He'd known Ben Miller since they were boys. The man had 3 children under 10 and a pregnant wife. He's staying with the Johnsons tonight. Sarah took the kids. Ben, he wasn't making much sense when I talked to him. Kept saying the land was cursed, that we'd all been fools to think we could build anything out here that would last. Cole led Copper to the stable, Thomas following. As he unsaddled the mare and gave her the precious ration of grain they'd been saving, he could feel his brother's eyes on him. "You talked to Garrison?" Thomas finally asked. "Yeah. And September 1st is final. No more extensions." The silence that followed was heavy with implications. Thomas leaned against a support beam, and in the dim light of the stable, he looked both younger and older than his years. "So that's it then," he said quietly. "We're done." "No." Cole turned to face his brother. "I've got an idea. It's risky, maybe even crazy, but it's a chance." He explained his plan: to dig a deep well, to go down as far as they needed to find water. As he talked, he watched Thomas's expression shift from disbelief to skepticism to something that might have been hope. "Cole, we don't know the first thing about digging wells that deep. And even if we did, we don't have the equipment, the money, or the time. We have shovels and picks. We have 2 strong backs and every reason in the world to succeed. And we have 6 weeks, which is more than enough time if we work day and night. And if there's no water down there, if we dig for 6 weeks and find nothing but rock and clay, then we're no worse off than we are now." Cole met his brother's eyes. "Thomas, we're drowning here. This drought is killing us slowly, and the bank is about to finish the job. We can sit back and let it happen, or we can fight. Maybe we lose either way, but at least if we fight, we go down swinging." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, his jaw working as he processed the proposal. Then slowly, he nodded. "Where do we dig?" Cole had been thinking about that on the ride home. The low point near the old creek bed, where the cottonwoods used to grow. If there's water anywhere under this land, it'll be there. The trees wouldn't have grown that tall without deep roots finding something. Those trees have been dead for 2 months. The roots go down. The water might still be there, just deeper than the trees could reach once the drought hit. It wasn't much of a theory, more like a desperate hope dressed up in logic, but it was all they had. They started the next morning at dawn, before the heat became unbearable. The location Cole had chosen was a 1/4 mile from the ranch house, in a slight depression where a seasonal creek had once run during spring runoff. The ground was hard as iron, baked by weeks of relentless sun, and those first hours were an education in just how difficult their task would be. "Jesus," Thomas gasped after they dug down barely 2 feet. "We're going to need to go 60 times this deep?" Cole didn't answer, just kept swinging his pick, feeling the impact jar his shoulders and arms. They fell into a rhythm. One man with the pick to break up the earth, the other with the shovel to clear it away. Every 30 minutes, they switched positions. Every hour, they stopped to drink from their dwindling water supply and catch their breath. By noon, they'd made it 5 feet down, and Cole's hands were bleeding through the work gloves. The temperature in the hole was somehow even hotter than the surface, and the walls kept trying to collapse inward, forcing them to shore up the sides with scrap lumber from the barn. "This is insane," Thomas said, but he didn't stop digging. By nightfall, they'd reached 8 feet, and every muscle in Cole's body was screaming. They climbed out of the hole and collapsed on the ground beside it, too exhausted to even make it back to the house. The stars wheeled overhead, indifferent and eternal, and somewhere in the distance a coyote howled its lonely song to the dying land. 6 weeks, Thomas said into the darkness, to go 52 more feet. "We'll make it." "You can't know that." "No," Cole agreed. "But I can believe it. And right now, that's all we've got." The days blurred together into an endless cycle of digging, exhaustion, and dreamless sleep. They worked from first light until they literally could no longer lift their tools, then crawled out of the hole and fell into their beds, only to wake a few hours later and do it all again. Word spread through the valley about what the Maddox brothers were attempting. Some of the neighboring ranchers rode out to watch, standing around the edge of the growing pit with expressions that ranged from pity to grudging admiration. A few offered to help, but Cole turned them down. They had their own problems, their own failing ranches to worry about. This was his gamble, his choice, and he wouldn't drag others down with him if it failed. At 20 feet, they hit a layer of clay so dense that progress slowed to inches per hour. Cole's hands were a mass of blisters and calluses, and Thomas had developed a cough from breathing dust and dirt all day. But they kept going. At 30 feet, the walls began to weep, tiny droplets of moisture that made Cole's heart race with hope. But when they dug deeper, the moisture disappeared and they realized they'd only hit a pocket of damp soil, not actual water. "It's something," Thomas insisted. "Moisture means we're getting close." "Oh, or it means nothing," Cole replied, but he didn't slow down. At 40 feet, they lost their first tool, a shovel that slipped from Thomas's grip and fell, the handle snapping when it hit the bottom. They hauled it up, but the break was clean and couldn't be repaired. They were down to 1 shovel and 2 picks, and the weight of all that earth above them was starting to feel oppressive. What if the walls collapse? Thomas asked one night, giving voice to the fear they'd both been carrying. What if we're down there and it all comes down? Then we shore up better. We move slower, more carefully. But Cole knew his brother was right to worry. They were operating far beyond their skill level, doing work that should have been left to professionals with proper equipment and training. Every time they descended into that pit, they were risking their lives on nothing more than stubborn hope. At 45 feet, something changed. Cole was swinging the pick when he felt the impact change. Less resistance, a different sound. He swung again, harder, and the pick broke through into a hollow space beyond. His heart hammering, he widened the hole, and Thomas brought the lantern closer. "What is it?" his brother asked. "I don't know. Could be a cavity in the rock, could be—" Water trickled through the opening, a tiny stream that caught the lamplight and gleamed like liquid gold. For a moment, neither of them moved. They just stared at that impossible sight. Water, actual water, flowing from the wound they'd carved into the earth. Then Thomas let out a whoop that probably carried all the way back to the ranch house, and Cole found himself laughing, a sound he hadn't made in months. They'd done it. Against all odds, despite every reasonable voice that said it was impossible, they'd found water. They spent the next hour carefully enlarging the opening, and the trickle became a flow, then a steady stream. By the time they climbed out of the pit, both of them were soaked and grinning like fools. "We need to cap it," Cole said, his mind already racing ahead to the logistics. "Build a proper wellhead, install a pump." "Cole." Thomas grabbed his arm, his expression suddenly serious. "We need to tell people. The whole valley needs to know about this." And that's when Cole realized the full scope of what they'd accomplished. This wasn't just about saving the Maddox Ranch anymore. If there was water at 45 feet here, there might be water at similar depths across the valley. They'd found more than a well. They'd found hope, a blueprint for survival that could save everyone. But hope, Cole would learn, was a complicated thing. The next morning, before they could spread the word, a stranger rode into Red Hollow Valley. She arrived alone, on a gray gelding that looked as travel-worn as she did, and she went straight to the Maddox Ranch as if she'd been given specific directions. Cole was working on the wellhead when he heard the horse approaching. He looked up to see a woman dismounting, and his first thought was that she didn't belong here. She was too clean, too composed, dressed in practical riding clothes that were dusty from travel but clearly well made. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple braid, and when she looked at him, her eyes were the color of steel in winter, sharp, assessing, and utterly unafraid. "Cole Maddox?" she asked. "That's right. Who's asking?" "My name is Alara Quinn." She approached with a confident stride, and something about her movements reminded Cole of a predator, economical, purposeful, dangerous. "I heard you struck water at 45 feet. I'd like to see it." Cole's hand moved instinctively toward the rifle propped against the well frame. News traveled fast on the frontier, but this fast? And how did a stranger know his name, know about the well, know to come here? "Where'd you hear that?" he asked carefully. "I make it my business to know where people are finding water." She stopped a respectful distance away, seeming to sense his wariness. "Especially in drought country. May I see the well, Mr. Maddox? I promise I'm not here to stake a claim or cause trouble." There was something in her voice, an educated accent that spoke of eastern cities, maybe even Europe, that didn't match the rough frontier setting. Cole studied her for a long moment, trying to read her intentions and finding only that same calm, almost scientific curiosity. "Why do you care about our well, Miss Quinn?" "Because I can help you find more." She met his eyes directly. "And because if I'm right about what you've tapped into, this valley doesn't have to die. None of the ranches have to fail. But I need to see your water source first." Cole should have sent her away. Every instinct told him that this woman represented some kind of complication he didn't need, some variable that would upset the delicate balance of his plans. But there was also something in her certainty, her absolute confidence, that intrigued him despite his better judgment. "Thomas," he called toward the ranch house, "we've got company." His brother emerged, took one look at Alara Quinn, and his eyebrows rose in a silent question. Cole just shook his head. He had no idea what to make of her either. They led her to the well, and she spent 20 minutes examining everything: the depth, the flow rate, the mineral content of the water, even the angle of the sun, and the position relative to the old creek bed. She didn't speak during this inspection, just moved with methodical precision, occasionally pulling out a small notebook to make brief notations. Finally, she straightened and turned to face them both. "You got lucky," she said bluntly. "This aquifer is part of a larger underground system that runs northeast to southwest across the entire valley. But it's not evenly distributed, and most of it is too deep to reach without better equipment than what you have. What you've tapped is a relatively shallow branch. Call it a finger of the main flow." "How do you know all this?" Thomas asked, voicing the question Cole was thinking. "I'm a hydrologist," Ilar replied, as if that explained everything. "I study water, where it goes, how it moves, why some land holds it and other land doesn't. I've spent the last 5 years mapping underground water sources across the Western Territories." Cole frowned. "If you're so good at finding water, why aren't you working for the government or a mining company? Why ride into a dying valley alone?" For the first time, something flickered across Ilar's composed expression. A shadow, a hint of pain quickly suppressed. "Because I have my own reasons for being here. And because I've learned that the people who need my help most are rarely the ones who can afford to pay for it." There was a story there, Cole sensed, layers of history and hurt, that this woman carried like armor beneath her professional competence. But before he could press further, she was already moving on, all business again. "I can show you where else to dig," she said, "for your ranch and for your neighbors. With the right placement, you could have 6, maybe 8 productive wells within a month. Enough to save most of the valley, if people are willing to work for it." It sounded too good to be true. It sounded like a con, or at best a well-meaning delusion from someone who'd read too many books and not spent enough time in the harsh reality of the frontier. But then Cole looked at his well, at the water flowing clear and cold from 45 feet down, and remembered that a week ago that had seemed impossible too. "What do you want in return?" he asked. Alara smiled, and it was a complicated expression, part amusement, part something darker. "Right now, just a place to stay for a few weeks, food, shelter, and your trust. The rest we can figure out later." Cole and Thomas exchanged a look. Every rational bone in Cole's body was screaming at him to send this stranger away, to not complicate an already precarious situation with an unknown variable. But there was also a voice, quieter but insistent, that said this woman might be exactly what the valley needed. "One night," he said finally. "You can stay one night, show us your maps or whatever proof you have tomorrow. Then we'll decide." Alara nodded, unsurprised. "Fair enough." As she led her horse toward the barn, Thomas moved close to Cole and spoke in a low voice. "Are we really considering this? We don't know anything about her." "We didn't know anything about that aquifer either," Cole replied. "But we dug anyway, and it paid off. Sometimes you have to take risks on incomplete information." "This is different. This is a person, not a hole in the ground. People are complicated. People lie." Cole watched Alara Quinn unsaddle her horse with practiced deficiency, and he had to admit his brother had a point. There was something about this woman that didn't quite add up. The expensive education combined with the lone wandering, the scientific knowledge paired with a willingness to work for nothing more than room and board. She was hiding something, or running from something, or both. But she also might be their salvation. One night, Cole repeated, "We'll hear her out, check her credentials, and make a decision with clear heads tomorrow." What he didn't say, what he barely admitted to himself, was that he'd already made his decision the moment Alara Quinn had looked at his well and described the invisible rivers flowing beneath their feet with absolute certainty. She knew something he desperately needed to know, and pride be damned, he was going to learn it. That night they sat around the dinner table, Cole, Thomas, and their unexpected guest, and Alara spread out maps and charts that looked like they'd been drawn by someone who saw the world in layers invisible to normal eyes. She traced lines across paper representations of Red Hollow Valley, explaining concepts like water tables and geological strata and artesian pressure with an ease that suggested years of study. "The drought hasn't destroyed the water," she explained, her finger following a path that ran roughly parallel to the old creek bed. "It's just pushed it deeper, consolidated it into these underground channels. On the surface, you're dying. 20 feet down, you're already seeing improvement. At 50, 60 feet, you hit the main flow, enough water to sustain this entire valley for decades, drought or no drought." "If it's there, why hasn't anyone found it before?" Thomas asked, his skepticism still evident. Because drilling deep wells requires knowledge most ranchers don't have, equipment that's expensive and hard to transport, and a willingness to invest time and money into something that might not pay off. Most people would rather trust in rain and luck than bet everything on an invisible maybe. But you're willing to bet on it, Cole said. Alara met his eyes across the table. I've spent 5 years studying this. I've seen aquifers that could transform desert into paradise, watched entire communities thrive because someone had the courage to dig deep enough. And I've also seen greed and short-sightedness destroy those same resources because people didn't understand what they had or how to protect it. There was passion in her voice now, a fervor that transcended mere professional interest. Cole found himself leaning forward, drawn by the force of her conviction. So you're a crusader, he said, riding around the West, saving doomed valleys out of the goodness of your heart. I'm a scientist trying to make up for past mistakes, Alara corrected, and there was steel beneath the words. What happened before is my business. What happens here is yours. I'm offering you a choice, Mr. Maddox. Keep struggling alone or accept help from someone who actually knows what she's talking about. The silence that followed was tense, charged with implications and unspoken questions. Finally, Thomas spoke up. Say we trust you. Say we dig where you tell us and we find water. What then? How do we convince the rest of the valley to do the same? Most of them are broke, exhausted, ready to give up. They're not going to invest everything in a stranger's promises. Then we show them. Alara's smile was sharp, confident. We don't ask them to believe, we give them proof they can't deny. You've already done the hardest part by finding that first well. Now we build on it. We sink another well, maybe 2, on your property. We measure the flow, demonstrate the sustainability, and when your neighbors see your cattle thriving, your land green, your debt cleared, they'll come to us. Desperation is a powerful motivator, Mr. Maddox. Right now, it's working against you. But with the right approach, we can turn it into our greatest ally. Cole looked at his brother, saw his own uncertainty reflected there, and made the kind of decision that would later seem inevitable, but in the moment felt like stepping off a cliff. All right, he said, tomorrow we start on the second well. You pick the location, we provide the labor. But Miss Quinn, if you're lying, if this is some kind of scam, you won't like what happens next. I wouldn't expect anything less, Alara replied, and for the first time since she'd arrived, her smile reached her eyes. Trust has to be earned, Mr. Maddox. Tomorrow, I'll start earning it. She was as good as her word. The next morning, Alara walked the property with a measured pace, occasionally stopping to examine the soil or check her maps against the visible landscape. Cole and Thomas followed, trying to understand her methodology, and mostly just being confused by the technical terms she casually threw around. Finally, she stopped at a point roughly 300 yards from the first well, in a spot that looked to Cole's eye no different from any other patch of dying grass. Here, she said with certainty. 60 feet down, you'll hit water. More flow than the first well and cleaner, less mineral content because it's pulling from deeper in the aquifer. You're sure? Cole asked. As sure as I can be without actually drilling. But Mr. Maddox, nothing in geology is absolute. The Earth keeps secrets. I'm offering you the best information I have, based on years of study and experience. The final gamble is still yours to make. There was honesty in that admission, a lack of false certainty that somehow made Cole trust her more than if she'd promised guaranteed success. She understood the stakes, respected the risk, and was asking them to believe not in miracles but in science. They started digging. This time, armed with Alara's knowledge, the work went faster. She'd brought equipment of her own, specialized tools for measuring soil density and moisture content, charts for predicting how different layers would behave. She couldn't do the actual digging, but she could tell them when they were going too slow, when the walls needed reinforcing, when they could push harder without risking collapse. At 20 feet, they hit the same layer of dense clay that had slowed them before, but Alara had predicted it and coached them through the best techniques for breaking it apart. At 30 feet, Thomas's shovel struck something hard, and for a terrible moment, Cole thought they'd hit bedrock. But Alara examined the obstruction and identified it as a large stone, isolated rather than part of a continuous layer. They spent 6 hours working it free, and when it finally came loose, the depression it left revealed damp earth beneath. A promising sign. At 40 feet, the walls began to weep, and this time the moisture didn't disappear when they dug deeper. It increased, grew more pronounced, until they were working in conditions that were almost muddy compared to the bone-dry soil of the surface. "We're close," Alara said, her voice tight with excitement. "Another 10, maybe 15 feet. At 53 feet, Cole's pick broke through, and water rushed in. Not a trickle like before, but a genuine flow that within minutes had pooled 6 inches deep at the bottom of the shaft. They scrambled up the ladder, and all 3 of them stood at the edge of the new well, watching it fill with something that looked like salvation. "You were right," Thomas said, and there was awe in his voice. "My God, you were actually right." Alara didn't gloat, just watched the water rise with the satisfied expression of a scientist whose hypothesis had been confirmed. "We should measure the flow rate, test the sustainability over 24 hours before we celebrate too much. But yes, this is everything I hoped it would be." Cole found he couldn't speak. 2 weeks ago, his ranch had been dying, his future measured in weeks before total collapse. Now he had 2 productive wells, each flowing clean and cold from depths that would be unaffected by surface drought. The immediate crisis wasn't over. He still had debt, still had months of work ahead to rebuild his herd and restore his land. But for the first time since the drought began, he could see a path forward that didn't end in failure. "Thank you," he said to Alara, and the words felt inadequate for what she'd given them. She turned to him, and something in her expression softened. "Don't thank me yet, Mr. Maddox. This is just the beginning. Now comes the hard part, convincing your neighbors to take the same leap of faith you did." And that, Cole would discover, was a challenge that rivaled even the physical labor of digging through 50 feet of earth. Because people, unlike rock and soil, couldn't be understood through maps and measurements. They had pride, fear, and a deep resistance to trusting strangers who promised miracles. But they also had desperation. And in the summer of 1878, in a valley balanced on the knife edge between survival and extinction, desperation would prove to be the catalyst that changed everything. The news spread through Red Hollow Valley like wildfire through dry grass, carried by rumors and eyewitness accounts that grew more elaborate with each retelling. Cole Maddox had found water, not just once, but twice. Deep water, good water, enough to fill troughs and irrigate land that had been cracked and dead just weeks before. And he'd done it with help from a mysterious woman who claimed she could read the earth like other people read books. Cole stood at the edge of his second well, 3 days after they'd struck water, watching his remaining cattle drink their fill for the first time in months. The animals had stopped their restless pacing, their ribs were less prominent, and a few had even begun to put weight back on. It was a small miracle, one that filled him with a satisfaction so profound it bordered on pain. "They're coming," Thomas said, riding up from the direction of town. His face was flushed with excitement or anxiety. Cole couldn't tell which. "Half the valley looks like. Hendricks is leading them, and he's bringing the others who haven't pulled out yet." Cole's stomach tightened. He'd known this moment was inevitable. Word of their success couldn't stay contained, not in a community this desperate. But knowing and being ready were 2 different things. He glanced toward the ranch house, where Alara was inside studying her maps and making calculations for potential well sites across the valley. "How many?" he asked. "Dozen families, maybe more. Cole, they're desperate. Some of them look like they haven't eaten properly in weeks. If they think we're hoarding water or keeping secrets, we're not hoarding anything," Cole cut him off. "And the only secret we have is standing in our kitchen right now, willing to help anyone who will listen." But even as he said it, he wondered if that was entirely true. In the 3 days since Alara had proven herself, Cole had begun to understand that her knowledge came with complications he hadn't fully considered. She could find water, yes, but the process of convincing hardened, suspicious ranchers to trust a woman they'd never met, to invest their last resources in holes dug at her direction, that was going to require a kind of salesmanship Cole had never attempted. The procession arrived 20 minutes later, a ragged line of wagons and riders that looked more like refugees than the proud, independent ranchers they'd been a year ago. James Hendricks dismounted first, his weathered face creased with an expression caught between hope and skepticism. "Cole," he said, nodding, "heard you struck it rich." "Not rich, just found water where I needed it. Twice, from what I'm hearing, and both times in spots nobody would have thought to dig." Hendricks's eyes were sharp, calculating. "That's either the luckiest coincidence in frontier history, or you've got help." The kind of help the rest of us could use. The others were gathering now, forming a loose semicircle around Cole and the well. He recognized most of them. Bill Patterson with his 3 sons, Sarah Miller representing her husband, who was too broken to come himself, old Marcus Webb, who'd been ranching in Red Hollow since before the Maddox family arrived, and at least 10 others whose names and stories Cole knew by heart. These were his neighbors, his community, and they were looking at him with a mixture of hope and resentment that made his chest ache. "You've got questions," Cole said, keeping his voice level. "I understand that. Before I answer them, I want you all to see something." He led them to the second well, where the water was still flowing strong and clear into a stone-lined reservoir they'd built. The sight of it, actual water, abundant and clean in the middle of the worst drought anyone could remember, drew gasps and murmurs from the assembled crowd. 53 feet down, Cole said. "Took us 4 days of digging, but it's there. And according to the woman who helped us find it, this is just the beginning. There's an entire underground system running beneath this valley, deep enough that the drought can't touch it." "What woman?" Marcus Webb's voice was rough with suspicion. "We heard rumors, but nobody knows who she is or where she came from." As if summoned by the question, Alara emerged from the ranch house, carrying her maps and walking with that same confident stride that had impressed Cole from the beginning. She tied her hair back and wore practical clothes that suggested she expected to get dirty, but there was still something refined about her, something that marked her as an outsider. The crowd's reaction was immediate and mixed. Several men straightened, suddenly aware of their appearance. A few women exchanged glances that spoke volumes about their opinion of a single woman traveling alone in frontier country. And more than one face showed open distrust. "My name is Alara Quinn," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the assembled group. "I'm a hydrologist. I study water and where it can be found underground. Mr. Maddox hired me to locate viable well sites on his property, and I've been successful. I'm prepared to offer the same service to anyone here who wants it." "For how much?" Bill Patterson called out. "We're all broke, lady." "If you're looking to get rich off our suffering, I'm not looking to get rich at all," Alara interrupted, her tone sharp enough to cut through the murmuring. "My fee is room and board while I work, nothing more. I'll map your land, identify the best drilling sites, and advise on depth and technique. What you do with that information is your own business." The silence that followed was heavy with disbelief. Marcus Webb finally spoke, his voice dripping with skepticism. "Nobody works for free, especially not educated folk from back east. What's your angle?" Alara's jaw tightened, and for a moment Cole thought she might lose her temper. Instead, she took a deliberate breath and met Webb's eyes directly. "My angle, Mr. Webb, is that I've spent 5 years watching communities die because they didn't understand their own land. I've seen good people lose everything while sitting on top of resources that could have saved them. If only someone had bothered to look deeper. I don't expect you to trust me. I'm a stranger, and trust has to be earned. But I'm asking you to look at Mr. Maddox's wells and ask yourself if you can afford not to at least consider what I'm offering." "Consider it how?" Sarah Miller stepped forward, her thin face drawn with exhaustion. "My husband lost every head of cattle we owned. We've got 3 children and a 4th on the way, and the bank is breathing down our necks same as everyone else. Even if you could find water on our land, we don't have the strength or the tools to dig 60 feet down." "Then we help each other," Cole said, the words coming out before he'd fully thought them through. "Thomas and I, we've learned something about deep well digging these past weeks. We've got equipment, experience, and strong backs. What we don't have is enough time to save just our own ranch and pay off our debt before September. But if we work together, if we pool our resources and help each dig where Miss Quinn says we should, we might all make it." Thomas shot him a look that clearly said they needed to discuss this privately, but Cole ignored it. He was committed now, following an instinct that said their survival was tied to the survival of the community, whether they liked it or not. "You're talking about a collective," Marcus Webb said, making it sound like an accusation. "Sharing profits, dividing labor, that's not how ranching works. Every man for himself, that's the frontier way." "The frontier way is dying," Cole shot back. "Look around, Marcus. Half the valley is already gone. The rest of us are barely hanging on. If we keep fighting alone, we all lose. But if we stand together, if we actually help each other instead of pretending we're islands, maybe we survive this." Hendricks had been quiet through most of the exchange, But now he stepped forward, his expression thoughtful. Let's say we agree to this. How would it work? Who decides whose land gets dug first? How do we split the labor fairly when some of us are stronger than others? Some have more land. Some have bigger debts. We hold a meeting, Elara said. Tonight, if possible. Everyone who's interested brings their land deeds and bank statements. I'll survey each property and rank them by likelihood of success and urgency of need. Then we create a schedule. Work crews that rotate through each ranch, digging until we hit water, or hit a depth that makes it clear we need to try a different location. And if we dig on someone's land and find nothing, Patterson asked, who eats that loss? We all do, Cole said firmly. If we're doing this, we do it as a community. Success belongs to everyone, and so does failure. That's the only way it works. The crowd erupted into arguments and crosstalk, neighbors debating neighbors, families conferring among themselves. Cole watched the chaos with a sinking feeling, wondering if he'd just made a terrible mistake. Asking independent ranchers to work collectively, to trust not just each other but a stranger with an unproven theory. It might be too much, too fast. But then Sarah Miller raised her voice above the din. I'm in, she said, her chin lifted in defiance of the doubt surrounding her. My husband's broken, my children are hungry, and I've got nothing left to lose. If Miss Quinn says there's water under my land and Mr. Maddox is willing to help me find it, I'll take that chance. Her declaration seemed to shift something in the crowd. Other voices began to join hers, tentative at first, then with growing confidence. Patterson and his sons, two of the smaller ranchers whose names Cole barely knew. Even old Marcus Webb, after a long moment of consideration, gave a grudging nod. All right, he said. One well. We start with one property, dig where the lady says, and see what happens. If it works, we keep going. If it doesn't, we scatter and everyone finds their own way. Fair? It wasn't the ringing endorsement Cole had hoped for, but it was enough. He looked at Elara, who was watching the proceedings with an expression of cautious optimism, and received a slight nod in return. Fair, Cole agreed. We meet tonight at the church, 7 o'clock. Bring your maps, your deeds, whatever you've got that shows your land boundaries. Miss Quinn will need to study them before she can make recommendations. As the crowd began to disperse, already arguing among themselves about the logistics and implications of what they'd just agreed to, Hendricks lingered behind. He waited until most of the others were out of earshot before speaking. That was either the bravest thing I've ever seen or the most foolish, he said quietly. You just tied your fate to a dozen failing ranches and a woman you've known for less than a week. I know, Cole replied. Your debt is your own, Cole. You could have kept your wells secret, sold your excess water at a premium, and cleared your obligations while the rest of us went under. Instead, you're gambling that we can all make it together. The valley dies, my ranch dies with it, Cole said. Who am I going to sell cattle to if there's nobody left? Where will I find help when I need it if all my neighbors are gone? This isn't charity, James. It's survival. Hendricks studied him for a long moment, then extended his hand. I misjudged you, Cole Maddox. I thought you were just your father's son, stubborn and proud. Turns out you might be smarter than all of us. The handshake was firm, sealed with the kind of respect that had to be earned through action rather than words. As Hendricks rode away, Thomas appeared at Cole's elbow. We need to talk, his brother said grimly. Now. They walked to the barn out of earshot from Elara and anyone else who might be lingering. Thomas's face was stormy, and Cole braced himself for the argument he knew was coming. What the hell were you thinking? Thomas demanded. We're barely solvent ourselves, and you just committed us to digging wells for the entire valley? Do you have any idea how much work that is? How much time we don't have? I know exactly what I committed us to. Do you? Because from where I'm standing, you just put our ranch second to everyone else's problems. We've got 5 weeks until the bank comes calling, Cole. 5 weeks to generate enough income to clear our debt. And instead of focusing on that, you want to spend our time and energy helping people who might not even succeed? Cole felt his own temper rising. And what happens when we save our ranch but everyone else loses theirs? What happens to the value of our land when Red Hollow becomes a ghost town? We can't survive alone, Thomas. I thought you understood that. I understand we have responsibilities to ourselves first. That's not selfish, that's basic survival. No, Cole said sharply. Basic survival is making sure you have a community to survive in. Our ranch is worth nothing if it's the last one standing in a dead valley. I need you to trust me on this, little brother. I need you to believe that saving everyone is the same as saving ourselves." Thomas's jaw worked as he struggled with conflicting emotions, loyalty to his brother versus his own pragmatic instincts. Finally, he let out a long breath. "Fine, but if this goes wrong, if we lose everything because you decided to play savior, then it's on me," Cole finished. "I'll take the blame. But Thomas, I don't think it's going to go wrong. I think Alara knows what she's doing, and I think if we can get the community working together, we're all stronger for it." "I hope you're right," Thomas said quietly. "Because if you're not, we're going to lose more than just land." The meeting that night was tense and chaotic, held in the small church that served as Red Hollow's community center. 23 families showed up, representing nearly every ranch that hadn't already abandoned the valley. They crowded into pews and lined the walls, creating a humid press of bodies and competing voices that made productive conversation nearly impossible. Alara stood at the front, her map spread across a makeshift table, and waited for the noise to die down. When it didn't, Cole stepped up beside her and raised his voice. "Listen up," he called out, using the authoritative tone his father had employed when dealing with unruly cattle buyers. "We're here because we all need the same thing, water. Miss Quinn has agreed to help us find it, but she can't do that if nobody's willing to listen, so everyone shut up and let her talk." The room gradually quieted, though undercurrents of conversation and skepticism still rippled through the assembled crowd. Alara acknowledged Cole with a slight nod, then began. "I've studied the geological surveys of this region, such as they exist, and combined them with what I've observed on the ground. Red Hollow Valley sits above a significant underground aquifer, essentially a river of water flowing through porous rock and sand about 40 to 70 feet below the surface. The drought has depleted the shallow sources you've all been relying on, but it hasn't touched this deeper reserve." She pointed to her map, where she'd marked the theoretical path of the aquifer in bold lines. The water flows roughly northeast to southwest, following the ancient creek beds that formed this valley millions of years ago. Not every property will have equal access. Some of you are sitting directly above the main channel. Others are on the edges where the flow is weaker or deeper. My job is to tell you where your best chances are. "And if you're wrong," someone called from the back, "if we dig where you say and find nothing but dry rock, then you'll have wasted time and effort," Alara replied bluntly. "I can't guarantee success on every property. What I can guarantee is that my recommendations are based on sound scientific principles and years of field experience. The alternative is to keep guessing randomly or give up entirely. Those are your choices." Marcus Webb stood up, his old bones creaking. "Let's say you're right about this aquifer. Let's say we all dig and we all find water. What then? How do we keep the big ranchers from moving in and claiming it all? How do we protect what we've built?" It was a valid concern, one that Cole hadn't fully considered. If word spread that Red Hollow was sitting on unlimited water while surrounding territories suffered, they could face an influx of opportunists and claim jumpers that would destroy the fragile community they were trying to build. "We form a water cooperative," Alara said, and there was steel in her voice. "Legal entity, registered with the territorial government. Everyone who participates in the collective effort gets shares proportional to their land and contribution. Those shares give you rights to the water and protection under the law. Anyone who tries to move in and take what you've built will have to fight not just individual ranchers, but a legally recognized organization." "You know a lot about frontier law for a scientist," Webb observed, his suspicion still evident. "I know a lot about what happens when people don't protect their resources," Alara countered. "I've seen communities torn apart by greed and poor planning. I won't watch it happen here if I can prevent it." The meeting went on for another 2 hours, with debates about work schedules, resource allocation, and the order in which properties would be surveyed. Alara listened to all of it with remarkable patience, occasionally offering suggestions but mostly letting the community work through their own logistics. By the time they adjourned, a rough framework had been established. Sarah Miller's property would be first, both because her need was most desperate and because Alara believed her land was directly above the main channel, offering the best chance of quick success. If they struck water there, they'd move to the Patterson Ranch, then the Webb Place, then work their way through the valley in an order determined by both need and geological probability. Work would begin at dawn. Cole walked Alara back to the ranch under a sky brilliant with stars, the air finally cooling after another brutal day of heat. She was quiet, her expression distant, and he found himself curious about the thoughts running through that sharp mind. "You handled that well," he said. "They're a tough crowd, and you didn't let them rattle you." "I've dealt with tougher," Ilara replied. "At least your neighbors are honest about their skepticism. I've worked with men who smiled to my face while planning to steal my research and claim credit for themselves." There it was again, that hint of a painful history, a story she wasn't willing to share. Cole wanted to press, to understand what had brought this brilliant, complicated woman to a dying frontier valley, but he sensed it wasn't the right time. "For what it's worth," he said instead, "I believe in you. What you're doing here, it matters." Ilara stopped walking and turned to face him. In the starlight, her features were softer, less guarded. "Why? Why do you trust me when everyone else thinks I'm either a fool or a con artist?" Cole considered the question seriously. "Because you could have asked for money, and you didn't. Because you look at the earth like it's speaking to you in a language nobody else can hear, and because you're the first person I've met who seems to care more about being right than being liked." Something shifted in her expression, surprise maybe, or recognition. For a moment, he thought she might tell him the truth about her past, about whatever ghost she was running from. But then the walls came back up, and she was all business again. "We should rest," she said. "Tomorrow's going to be a long day, and I need to survey the Miller property before we start digging." The Miller Ranch was 5 miles north of the Maddox spread, accessible by a rutted road that had seen better days. When Cole, Thomas, and Ilara arrived at dawn with their equipment, they found Sarah Miller waiting with her 3 children, 2 boys and a girl, none older than 10. The kids were too thin, their clothes patched and repatched, but their eyes were bright with hope. "Thank you for coming," Sarah said, and her voice trembled slightly. "Ben's inside. He wanted to help, but he's not himself since we lost the herd." Cole nodded, understanding more than she said. He'd seen strong men broken by the drought, watched as failure stripped away their sense of purpose and identity. Ben Miller had been a proud rancher, a good neighbor, and now he was a shell of himself, too ashamed to face the community that was trying to save him. Ilara surveyed the property with her usual methodical precision, walking the land in careful grids while consulting her instruments and maps. The children followed her like curious puppies, asking questions about what she was doing and why, and she answered with a patience Cole found surprising. "There," she said finally, pointing to a spot about 50 yards from the main house, near where an old well had run dry months ago. 48 feet down, you should hit the aquifer. The flow won't be as strong as the Maddox wells, you're further from the main channel, but it should be adequate for household needs and a modest herd." Cole and Thomas began digging while Sarah and her children watched. By mid-morning, they'd been joined by James Hendricks and his sons, then Bill Patterson and his crew. Word had spread, and people who'd agreed to the cooperative were showing up to help, drawn by curiosity and the fragile hope that this might actually work. The digging was brutal work, made worse by the knowledge that they were performing for an audience. Every foot they descended, Cole could feel the weight of expectation pressing down on him. If they failed here, on the first property they'd attempted after the Maddox Ranch, the entire cooperative would collapse before it really began. At 20 feet, they hit the clay layer. At 35, the walls began to weep, and at 46 feet, Thomas's pick broke through into flowing water. The cheer that went up from the assembled crowd was primal, a release of tension and fear that had been building for months. Sarah Miller collapsed to her knees sobbing while her children danced around the well like it was a miracle they'd witnessed. Even Ben Miller emerged from the house, drawn by the commotion, and when he saw the water rising in the shaft they'd dug on his land, something in his broken expression began to heal. "It's real," he said, his voice rough with disuse. "My God, it's real." Cole found himself grinning, the exhaustion and doubt of the past weeks momentarily forgotten in the simple joy of success. He looked at Ilara, who was standing apart from the celebration, and saw tears tracking down her face, silent, unexpected, and quickly wiped away. "2 for 2, Thomas said, clapping Cole on the shoulder. "Maybe you were right about all this after all." But Cole's attention was on Ilara, on the complex emotions playing across her usually controlled features. Whatever had driven her to this valley, whatever mistakes she'd mentioned making in her past, they were connected to this moment, to the water flowing from earth that had seemed dead and the hope rekindling in broken people. He walked over to her, aware that the others were too caught up in their own celebration to notice. "You all right?" he asked quietly. "I'm fine," she said, but her voice was thick. It's been a long time since I've seen something work out the way it was supposed to. A long time since I helped instead of hurt." "Want to talk about it?" "No." The word was firm, final. "But thank you for asking." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching as the community they were building came together around a well that represented more than just water. It was proof that cooperation could triumph over isolation, that science and hard work could defeat even nature's cruelty. The next 3 weeks passed in a blur of digging, measuring, and celebration. They struck water at the Patterson Ranch after 62 feet of hard labor. The Webb property yielded results at 54 feet. The smaller spreads proved more challenging. 2 came up dry and had to be resited based on Alar's revised calculations. But eventually, even those stubborn plots revealed their hidden reserves. By the 3rd week of August, 14 ranches had viable deep wells, and the valley was transforming before their eyes. Cattle that had been skeletal were filling out. Fields that had been dust were being irrigated and showing the first hints of green. The town of Red Hollow, which had seemed destined to become another ghost town scattered across the Western Territories, was buzzing with renewed energy. But with success came new problems. The cooperative was functioning, but barely. Arguments broke out over water rights, work assignments, and the division of resources. Some ranchers wanted to hoard their newfound water rather than share with neighbors. Others, seeing prosperity return, began questioning why they should remain part of a collective when they could now survive independently. And then there was the matter of Franklin Garrison. The banker had watched the valley's resurrection with growing alarm, recognizing that his carefully calculated foreclosures were being undermined by an underground river he couldn't control or claim. When Cole rode into town to make a payment on his debt, not the full amount, but a significant portion earned from selling water and services to neighbors, Garrison's expression was cold. "This is irregular," he said, examining the cash Cole had placed on his desk. "Where did you acquire this money, Mr. Maddox?" "Sold some cattle, contracted some labor. Does it matter? It's legal tender, and it's going toward my debt." "And the rest?" "You're still short by more than half. September 1st is 2 weeks away." "I know the date," Cole said evenly. "I'll have the rest by then." "Will you?" Garrison leaned back in his chair, and there was something calculating in his gaze. "I've been hearing interesting stories about your ranch, Mr. Maddox. About a woman who claims she can find water anywhere, about communal work crews and shared resources. It sounds almost revolutionary." The way he said the word made it clear it wasn't a compliment. Cole felt his guard go up. "It sounds like people helping each other survive. Is that a problem?" "It could be," Garrison said carefully. "There are interests in Denver, investors who've been watching Red Hollow Valley with considerable attention. They've been waiting for the drought to run its course, for properties to become available at distressed prices. Your sudden recovery is inconvenient for their plans." "Their plans can go to hell," Cole said flatly. "This is our valley, our land. If some Eastern investors thought they could swoop in and buy it cheap, they miscalculated." "Perhaps, or perhaps they'll simply adjust their strategy." Garrison's smile was thin, dangerous. "Be careful, Mr. Maddox. Success makes enemies faster than failure ever could." The warning stayed with Cole as he rode back to the ranch, a cold knot of worry forming in his stomach. He'd been so focused on the immediate crisis, finding water, saving the ranches, building the cooperative, that he hadn't considered the larger implications. Red Hollow Valley, previously worthless and dying, was now valuable again. And valuable things attracted predators. He found Alara at the second well, taking measurements and making notes in her leather journal. She looked up as he approached, and her expression sharpened at whatever she saw in his face. "What happened?" He told her about Garrison's warning, about the investors in Denver and the implied threat. As he spoke, he watched her features harden into something cold and fierce. "I was afraid of this," she said quietly. "Word was bound to spread eventually. We need to accelerate our plans for the water cooperative. Get it officially registered, make sure everyone's rights are legally protected before anyone tries to challenge them." "You sound like you've dealt with this before." "I have." She closed her journal with a sharp snap. "In Nevada, 3 years ago. We found a massive aquifer beneath what everyone thought was wasteland. Within 6 months, mining companies were filing competing claims, bribing officials, hiring lawyers to find loopholes. The community I was trying to help got torn apart by litigation and greed. What happened? They lost. The words were bitter, weighted with old guilt. The mining companies won, took the water rights, charged exorbitant fees to the very people whose land it came from. I watched families who'd lived there for generations get forced out by legal tactics they couldn't fight. It was my discovery that made it possible, my maps that showed them where to drill. I gave them the tools to destroy themselves. Cole finally understood the shadows he'd seen in her eyes, the careful way she guarded her past. She wasn't just running from failure. She was running from the consequences of success that had been twisted into something destructive. "That's not going to happen here," he said firmly. "We won't let it." "You can't know that. You're good people, Cole, all of you. But good people lose to bad people with lawyers and money all the time. That's how the world works." "Then we change how the world works." Cole reached out and took her hand, surprising both of them with the gesture. "We're not some scattered community that can be picked apart. We've built something here, Alara. We've got organization, we've got unity, and we've got you. Someone who understands the technical and legal aspects well enough to protect us." She looked at their joined hands, and for a moment he thought she might pull away. Instead, her fingers tightened around his. "I don't know if I can," she admitted quietly. "I don't know if I'm strong enough to watch it all fall apart again." "You won't be watching," Cole said. "You'll be fighting, and you won't be fighting alone." The words hung between them in the fading afternoon light, a promise that felt both necessary and terrifying. Alara's eyes searched his face, as if trying to determine whether he truly understood what he was offering, whether he grasped the magnitude of the fight they might be facing. Cole met her gaze steadily, his hand still wrapped around hers, and felt something shift between them, a connection deeper than circumstance or shared purpose. "We should get back," Alara said finally, though she didn't immediately pull away. "There's work to do if we're going to protect what we've built." They rode back to the ranch in silence, but it was a different quality of quiet than before, charged with possibility and an awareness of each other that Cole hadn't allowed himself to acknowledge until now. He'd been so focused on survival, on saving the land and meeting the bank's demands, that he'd barely noticed how Alara had become central to everything he was trying to accomplish. She wasn't just a tool for finding water anymore. She was becoming something far more important, far more dangerous to the careful walls he'd built around his heart. Thomas was waiting at the house with news that shattered any illusion of peace they might have harbored. His face was grim, and he held a telegram in his hand like it was a snake that might bite. "This came an hour ago," he said, thrusting the paper at Cole. "From Denver." Cole read the message twice, his jaw tightening with each word. The text was brief and professionally worded, but the threat was unmistakable. Western Territorial Development Corporation was filing claims on water rights throughout Red Hollow Valley, citing territorial statutes that gave priority to commercial entities engaged in land improvement. They had lawyers arriving within the week to assess properties and initiate legal proceedings. "How is this possible?" Thomas demanded. "We've been working this land for generations. The water is ours. We found it. We dug for it." "Actually, it's more complicated than that," Alara said, her voice tight with barely controlled anger. She took the telegram from Cole and studied it, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Under territorial law, surface water rights belong to landowners, but subsurface resources can be claimed by anyone who files the proper paperwork first. If Western Territorial Development has been monitoring the valley and moved quickly to register claims on the aquifer system, they might have legal standing." "That's insane," Cole said. "We're the ones who discovered it. Your research, our labor." "Doesn't matter," Alara cut him off. "What matters is who has the better legal claim and the resources to fight in court." This is exactly what happened in Nevada. The mining companies didn't care who found the water first. They just cared who could afford the best lawyers and had connections with the territorial government. Cole felt rage building in his chest, hot and dangerous. Everything they'd worked for, every drop of sweat and blood they'd invested in saving the valley, was being threatened by people who'd never set foot on this land, who saw their survival as nothing more than a business opportunity to be exploited. "We need to call a meeting," he said, "tonight. Everyone who's part of the cooperative needs to know what we're facing." The church was packed that evening, the atmosphere thick with tension and barely suppressed panic. Cole stood at the front with Alara, facing a sea of worried faces that had just begun to show hope again, and hated that he was about to deliver news that might crush it. He read the telegram aloud, then waited for the inevitable explosion of angry voices and fearful questions. It came like a thunderclap, ranchers shouting over each other, demanding to know how this could happen, what their options were, whether they should just give up now before wasting more time and resources on a fight they couldn't win. "Quiet!" Marcus Webb's voice cut through the chaos like a bullwhip. The old rancher stood up, his weathered face hard as granite. "Let the woman speak. She's seen this before. Let her tell us what we're up against." Alara stepped forward, and Cole saw her hands were trembling slightly before she clasped them behind her back. When she spoke, her voice was steady, professional, but he could hear the emotion beneath it. Western Territorial Development is a corporation based in Denver with significant capital and political connections. They specialize in acquiring land and water rights in developing territories, then selling or leasing those resources at premium prices. What they're attempting here is a form of claim jumping, using legal technicalities to seize control of resources they didn't discover or develop. "Can they actually do that?" Sarah Miller asked, her voice small and frightened. "Can they just take our water?" "If we let them, yes," Alara said bluntly. "But we have options. First, we accelerate the formation of the water cooperative I mentioned before. We file as a legal entity with the territorial government, establishing our collective claim to the aquifer system. Second, we document everything, every well we've dug, every measurement we've taken, every piece of research that proves we discovered and developed these resources. Third, we find a lawyer who's willing to fight for us, someone who understands water rights law and isn't afraid to go up against corporate interests. That's going to cost money," Bill Patterson said grimly. "Money most of us don't have. We've been pouring everything into digging wells and rebuilding our herds. How are we supposed to afford lawyers and legal fees? We pool our resources," Cole said. "The cooperative isn't just about sharing labor anymore. It's about sharing the burden of protecting what we've built. Every ranch contributes what they can. Those who have more give more. Those who have less give what they're able." "And if it's not enough?" Hendricks asked. "What if we scrape together every cent we have and it's still not enough to fight a Denver corporation with deep pockets?" The question hung in the air, unanswered, until Thomas spoke up from the back of the room. "Then we make noise," he said, moving forward to stand beside his brother. "We write letters to every newspaper in the territory. We make this public, make it political. Rich corporations stealing water from honest ranchers, that's a story that'll get attention. Maybe enough attention to make them back down or force the government to intervene on our behalf." It was a good idea, Cole realized. Perhaps their only real weapon against an enemy with superior resources was public opinion and the scrutiny it could bring. He looked at Alara and saw her nodding slowly, her strategic mind already working through the possibilities. "We'll need evidence," she said. "Not just documents, but testimony. Stories from families who almost lost everything, who were saved by this cooperative effort. We need to make this personal, make people understand what's at stake." "I'll write it," Sarah Miller said, standing up. "I'll tell them about watching my children go hungry, about my husband breaking under the weight of failure, about how your water saved us. If there are people out there who'll listen, I'll give them a reason to care." Others began volunteering to write letters, to spread word to neighboring territories, to contact any relatives or connections they had who might have influence with the territorial government. The panic that had gripped the room was transforming into determination, fear converting into fighting spirit. Cole felt a surge of pride watching his neighbors refuse to surrender, refuse to let outsiders steal what they'd built with their own hands. This was what he'd hoped for when he'd proposed the cooperative, not just shared labor, but shared strength, a community that could stand together against threats no individual could face alone. "We've got 2 weeks before their lawyers arrive," he said, raising his voice to be heard over the planning discussions that had broken out. 2 weeks to get organized, to document everything, to build our case. It won't be easy, and there's no guarantee we'll win. But if we're going to lose, let's make damn sure we lose fighting, not surrendering." The meeting lasted until well past midnight, with committees formed for legal documentation, public outreach, and financial coordination. By the time people began filtering out into the warm night, they had the skeleton of a plan and the will to see it through. It might not be enough, but it was something. and something was infinitely better than the helpless despair that had threatened to consume them. Cole found Alara outside the church, sitting on the steps and staring up at the stars. She looked exhausted, the careful composure she usually maintained worn thin by hours of explaining legal technicalities and strategic options. "You did good in there," he said, settling down beside her. "Did I? Because I feel like I'm leading them into a fight they can't win. Again. What happened in Nevada wasn't your fault. Wasn't it?" She turned to look at him, and her eyes were haunted. "I knew the risks. I'd seen how quickly greed could corrupt good intentions. But I was so sure that if I just gave people the information they needed, if I armed them with knowledge, they'd be able to protect themselves. I was naive. Knowledge without power is just fuel for other people's fires." Cole wanted to argue, to tell her she was being too hard on herself, but he understood the weight of responsibility she carried. She'd given communities the tools for prosperity, and those tools had been turned into weapons against them by people with resources and ruthlessness to exploit what she'd discovered. "This time is different," he said quietly. "This time you're not just dropping knowledge and walking away. You're staying. You're fighting with us." "Is that what I'm doing?" There was something vulnerable in her voice, a question beneath the question. "Or am I just setting myself up for another failure, another group of people I'll have to watch, lose everything?" "I don't know," Cole admitted, "but I know I'm glad you're here, and I know that whatever happens, you won't face it alone." She was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. "In Nevada, there was the man, another scientist, supposedly a colleague. He took my research, my maps, everything I'd discovered, and sold it to the mining companies, told them exactly where to drill, how deep to go, what arguments to make to establish legal claims. He made a fortune, and the community I'd been trying to help got destroyed." "What happened to him?" "Nothing. He's probably still out there somewhere, selling his expertise to the highest bidder. That's what made it worse. There were no consequences for his betrayal. The law protected him because what he did was technically legal. Immoral, destructive, but legal." Cole felt anger rising on her behalf, a fierce protective instinct that surprised him with its intensity. "Is that why you work alone now? Why you don't charge for your services?" "Partly. I also can't stand the thought of profiting from knowledge that could be used to hurt people. So I travel, I help where I can, and I try to stay one step ahead of the guilt that follows me." She looked at him, and there was something raw in her expression. "You're the first person I've told about this. Thomas knows I have a past, but not the details. I don't know why I'm telling you now." "Maybe because you're tired of carrying it alone," Cole suggested. "Maybe because you need someone to know the whole truth and choose to trust you anyway. And do you? Trust me, knowing what I've just told you?" "Yes?" The answer came without hesitation. "What happened in Nevada wasn't your fault. You can't control how people use information once you give it to them. All you can do is try to protect them as best you can, which is exactly what you're doing here." Alara's eyes glistened with unshed tears, and she looked away quickly, as if embarrassed by the display of emotion. "You're either very wise or very foolish, Cole Maddox." "Probably both," he said with a slight smile. "Seems to be my natural state." They sat together in comfortable silence, and Cole found his thoughts drifting to the fight ahead. 2 weeks to prepare for legal warfare they had no experience with, against opponents who likely had teams of lawyers and unlimited resources. The odds were terrible, possibly insurmountable, but he'd faced terrible odds before. The drought had seemed insurmountable too, until they'd started digging. The next morning, the valley began transforming into something resembling a military operation. Alara set up a command center in the Maddox ranch house, with maps and documents spread across every available surface. Thomas took charge of coordinating the work crews, making sure wells were being dug on schedule, while also collecting testimony and evidence for their legal defense. Cole found himself riding between properties, checking on progress and bolstering spirits when people began to waver. At the Patterson Ranch, he found Bill and his sons digging their third well, this one intended to supply water for irrigation. The older man was stripped to the waist despite the heat, his muscles still strong despite his 50-plus years. "We're at 40 feet, Bill reported, wiping sweat from his face. "Alara says we should hit water in another 10, but Cole, I've been thinking, even if we win this legal fight, what's to stop another corporation from trying the same thing next year or the year after? How do we protect ourselves long term?" It was a question Cole had been wrestling with himself. We make ourselves too strong to attack, he said. We don't just form a cooperative, we build real infrastructure, pipelines, irrigation systems, maybe even start selling water to other territories. We turn this into something so established, so essential to the regional economy, that nobody can just swoop in and take it without massive political consequences. Bill considered this, then nodded slowly. You're thinking bigger than just survival. I'm thinking about building something that lasts, something my children and yours can inherit without having to fight the same battles we're fighting now. You sound like a man with a vision, Bill said with a slight smile. And maybe a woman in mind to share it with? Cole felt heat rise to his face that had nothing to do with the sun. I don't know what you're talking about. Sure you don't. The way you and Miss Quinn look at each other, the way you defend her when folks question her motives, everyone's noticed, Cole. Not saying it's a bad thing, just saying you might want to figure out what you're feeling before you get too distracted to think straight. Cole opened his mouth to deny it, then closed it again. Was it that obvious? He'd been so focused on the external challenges that he hadn't paid much attention to what was developing between him and Alara, but Bill was right. There was something there, something that went beyond professional respect or gratitude. When he looked at her, he saw more than just a brilliant scientist or a troubled woman running from her past. He saw someone who matched him in strength and stubbornness, someone who challenged him to be better, to think bigger, to risk everything for what mattered. It's complicated, he said finally. Everything worth having usually is, Bill replied. Just don't wait too long to uncomplicate it. Life's too short and too uncertain for that kind of hesitation. The legal documents for the Red Hollow Valley Water Cooperative were completed 5 days later, drafted by a lawyer named Margaret Hendricks, James's sister who'd moved to Denver years ago and made a name for herself in territorial land disputes. She'd come back to help her family, charging them nothing beyond expenses, and her expertise proved invaluable. This is solid, she told Cole and Alara as they reviewed the paperwork in the Maddox kitchen. You've documented discovery dates, development timelines, and established collective ownership in a way that should hold up in court. But I need to be honest with you. Western Territorial Development has resources we can't match. They can drag this out for years if they want, bleed you dry with legal fees and delay tactics. So what do? Cole asked. We make them decide it's not worth the fight, Margaret said. We create enough public pressure, enough political heat, that continuing becomes more expensive than walking away. And we find leverage, something they want or fear more than they want your water. What kind of leverage? That's what I'm still figuring out. Give me a few days to do some research on Western Territorial Development, find out who's really behind it and what other interests they might have. Sometimes these corporations have vulnerabilities that aren't obvious at first glance. She left that evening, promising to return with anything useful she could find. Meanwhile, letters were being written and sent to every newspaper and political figure anyone in the valley had even a tenuous connection to. Sarah Miller's testimony was particularly powerful. A mother's account of watching her children suffer, written with stark honesty and emotional impact that made it impossible to read without being moved. Cole read it sitting at his kitchen table with Alara across from him making calculations for a proposed irrigation system. When he finished, he set the pages down carefully. This is going to break hearts, he said quietly. Everyone who reads this is going to feel what she went through. Good, Alara said without looking up. Hearts need to be broken sometimes. Comfortable people don't fight for justice. Uncomfortable people do. If we can make enough people uncomfortable with what's happening here, we might actually stand a chance. She was right, of course, but there was something cold in the assessment that bothered Cole. You talk about this like it's a military campaign. It is, Alara replied, finally meeting his eyes. We're at war with people who see your suffering as a business opportunity. If we want to win, we need to be strategic, not sentimental. There's a difference between being strategic and being callous. Is there? Because in Nevada, the people who won were the ones willing to be ruthless, the ones who tried to fight fair, who believed in justice and mercy. They lost everything. Cole heard the bitterness in her voice, the old wounds that hadn't healed. Maybe they lost property, he said carefully, but did they lose who they were? Because I'd rather fail as a good man than succeed by becoming someone I hate. Alara stared at him for a long moment, something complicated working across her features. You really believe that, don't you? You actually think integrity matters more than victory. I think integrity is the only victory that lasts, Cole said. Everything else is just temporary. Land can be taken, money can be lost, but who you are, that's yours until you give it away. She laughed, but it was a pained sound. You're going to get destroyed by people who don't share that philosophy. Maybe. Or maybe there are enough people left in this world who do share it that we actually have a fighting chance. He reached across the table and took her hand, feeling her initial resistance before she let him hold it. Alara, I know you've been hurt. I know you've seen the worst of what people can do to each other. But that doesn't mean everyone is like that. It doesn't mean this has to end the same way Nevada did. You don't know that. You're right, I don't, but I choose to believe it anyway. That's what faith is. Not blind optimism, but a decision to hope even when the evidence suggests you shouldn't. Alara pulled her hand away, standing up abruptly. I need air, she said, and left before Cole could respond. He sat alone in the kitchen, wondering if he'd pushed too hard, revealed too much of what he was beginning to feel for her. The boundaries between them were complicated. She was helping him save his ranch, his community, and getting emotionally involved could jeopardize that professional relationship. But the boundaries were already blurred, had been since the moment she'd arrived and looked at his land with eyes that saw invisible rivers and impossible hope. He found her an hour later at the second well, sitting on the stone rim and staring into the dark water below. The moon was nearly full, painting everything in shades of silver and shadow. I'm sorry, she said when she heard him approach. I shouldn't have walked out like that. You've got nothing to apologize for, Cole replied, settling down beside her. I was pushing when I should have been listening. No, you were right, about most of it anyway. She was quiet for a moment, gathering her thoughts. I've spent 3 years running from what happened in Nevada, convinced that getting close to people, caring about outcomes, was a weakness I couldn't afford. It's easier to be alone, to keep moving, to never stay long enough to see whether your work helps or hurts. But watching what's happening here, seeing the community you've built, it's making me remember why I started doing this in the first place. Why did you start? My father was a hydrologist. One of the first, actually, back when it was still more divination than science. He believed water was the key to civilizing the frontier, that if we could just understand how it moved and where it hid, we could transform wilderness into paradise. He died when I was 16, chasing that dream in the Arizona territory. Dysentery from bad water, ironically enough. Cole heard the pain beneath the clinical description. I'm sorry. I took up his work because I thought I could finish what he started, prove his theories, validate his life's work, maybe make his death mean something. And for a while I succeeded. I found aquifers nobody knew existed, helped communities thrive in places everyone said were uninhabitable. I was making a difference. Until Nevada. Until Nevada, she confirmed. Until I learned that knowledge without wisdom is dangerous, that helping people survive isn't enough if you don't also help them protect what they've built. My father would have been ashamed of what I let happen there. He believed in community, in cooperation, in using science to serve the common good. I failed all of that. Cole understood now why she'd been so insistent on forming the cooperative, on building legal protections, on preparing for threats that hadn't yet materialized. She was trying to make up for past failures, trying to prove she'd learned from her mistakes. You're not failing here, he said firmly. Whatever happens with Western territorial development, you've already succeeded in ways that matter. You've given people hope. You've shown them how to work together. You've taught me that my land is part of something bigger than just the Maddox family legacy. And if we lose, if they take the water anyway, then we'll have lost fighting for something worth fighting for, with people worth fighting alongside. That's not failure, Alara. That's life. Trying your best and accepting that the outcome isn't always in your control. She turned to look at him, and in the moonlight her eyes were luminous. When did you get so wise? I'm not wise, Cole said. I'm just stubborn enough to keep believing even when I shouldn't. Maybe that's the same thing. They sat together in silence, and Cole felt the walls between them crumbling, the careful distance they'd both been maintaining dissolving in the face of honesty and shared purpose. He wanted to kiss her, wanted to pull her close and promise that everything would work out, but he sensed she wasn't ready for that kind of vulnerability yet. So instead, he just sat with her, their shoulders touching, and let the silence speak what words couldn't. The lawyers from Western Territorial Development arrived on a Wednesday, stepping off the stage from Denver in expensive suits that looked absurd in the dust and heat of Red Hollow. There were three of them, led by a man named Harrison Caldwell, who carried himself with the kind of arrogance that came from never having been truly challenged. Cole met them at the saloon, along with Margaret Hendricks and representatives from the cooperative. Elara had wanted to come, but Margaret had advised against it. Better to keep their most valuable asset out of sight until they understood what they were dealing with. "Gentlemen," Caldwell said, setting his briefcase on the table with practiced precision, "I represent Western Territorial Development Corporation, which has filed legal claims on subsurface water rights throughout Red Hollow Valley. We're here to assess the situation and discuss terms for compensation and transfer of resources." "There's nothing to discuss," Cole said flatly. "The water belongs to the people who found it and developed it. We're not selling, and we're not transferring anything." Caldwell smiled, and it was the expression of a man who'd heard similar defiance countless times before and crushed it with equal regularity. "Mr. Maddox, I understand you're emotionally invested in this matter, but emotion doesn't supersede law. Western Territorial Development has legitimate claims filed with the territorial government, properly documented and legally sound. You can cooperate and receive fair compensation, or you can fight and receive nothing but legal fees and eventual foreclosure when you can't afford to continue the battle." "We'll fight," Margaret Hendricks said calmly, "and we'll win. Your claims may be filed correctly, but they're based on resources you didn't discover and had no hand in developing. The Red Hollow Valley Water Cooperative has established clear precedents through discovery, documentation, and active use. Any judge who isn't in your pocket will see that." Caldwell's smile didn't waver. "Miss Hendricks, your reputation precedes you, but I'm afraid you're overestimating the strength of your position. Discovery means nothing if it's not properly registered with territorial authorities. Your cooperative was formed after our claims were filed, making it legally subordinate to our interests." "Your claims were filed before the aquifer was even discovered," Margaret countered. "You can't claim rights to something you didn't know existed." "Actually, we can. Our filings were speculative, yes, but legally valid. We claimed potential subsurface water rights across a broad geographic area based on geological surveys suggesting the possibility of aquifer systems. The fact that your people subsequently confirmed our theory doesn't invalidate our prior claim." Cole felt his hands clenching into fists under the table. The lawyer was right. They'd been outmaneuvered by people who understood the legal system better than honest ranchers ever could. Western Territorial Development had filed blanket claims on theoretical resources, betting that if anything was found, they could use those preemptive filings to establish priority. "This is legal theft," Thomas said from behind Cole, his voice shaking with anger. "You're stealing from people who've worked this land for generations." "We're claiming rights that were never properly secured," Caldwell corrected. "If the ranchers of Red Hollow Valley had understood territorial law, they would have filed their own protective claims years ago. Their ignorance of the law doesn't create an obligation on our part to forfeit legitimate business interests." Margaret leaned forward, her expression hard. "What does Western Territorial Development actually want? Because I'm guessing you didn't send 3 lawyers to a dying valley just to claim water rights you could have seized through administrative proceedings. There's something else at play here." For the first time, Caldwell's polished demeanor showed a crack. He exchanged glances with his colleagues, some silent communication passing between them. "Our client is prepared to be reasonable," he said carefully. "We're not interested in destroying the local community or forcing people from their homes. We're businessmen, not monsters. What we propose is a licensing agreement. The cooperative would be granted continued use of the water resources in exchange for a percentage of any revenue generated, plus a modest annual fee to maintain the rights." "How modest?" Cole asked, though he already knew the answer would be anything but. 30% of gross revenue from water sales or usage, plus $5,000 annually per well site. The numbers were staggering, deliberately designed to be impossible to meet. At current rates, the cooperative might generate $15,000 a year from water sales if they pushed hard. 30% would take nearly half of that, and the annual fees would consume the rest and more. They'd be working just to pay Western Territorial Development, with nothing left over for actual ranch operations or debt repayment. "That's not reasonable," Margaret said coldly. "That's extortion dressed up in legal language." "That's business," Caldwell replied. You're welcome to reject the offer and take your chances in court. But I should warn you that litigation of this nature typically takes 3 to 5 years to resolve, costs upward of $50,000 in legal fees, and has a historical success rate of less than 20% for parties without significant capital reserves. Western Territorial Development has both the resources and the patience to see this through. Do you? The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Cole felt the weight of it pressing down on him. They didn't have $50,000. They didn't have $5,000. And 3 to 5 years of legal warfare would bankrupt every ranch in the valley, accomplishing Western Territorial Development's goals without them ever having to win in court. We need time to discuss this with our membership, Margaret said, gathering her papers. We'll have an answer for you within 48 hours. Take all the time you need, Caldwell said graciously, but I should mention that our offer has an expiration date. If we don't have agreement by the end of the week, we'll be proceeding with full legal action to establish our claims. At that point, the licensing terms will be significantly less favorable. They left the saloon in grim silence, and Cole felt like he'd just been in a physical fight and lost badly. Thomas was pale, Margaret was tight-lipped with anger, and the handful of other cooperative members who'd attended looked like they'd just watched their salvation turn into their damnation. Options? Cole asked Margaret when they were safely away from the lawyers. Limited and unpleasant, she admitted. They've built their case well. The preemptive filings give them legal standing, and they've got the resources to drag this out until we collapse. If we fight in court, we'll probably lose eventually, and we'll definitely go broke in the process. If we accept their terms, we'll go broke slightly slower while making them rich off our labor. So we're finished either way. Unless we can find leverage, Margaret said, something that makes continuing this fight more expensive or dangerous for them than backing down. But I don't know what that would be. Cole rode back to the ranch with the weight of defeat settling over him like a physical burden. They'd come so far, accomplished so much, only to have it stolen by people who'd never dug a single foot of earth or risked anything beyond legal fees. It was unjust, infuriating, and apparently inevitable. Alara was waiting on the porch, and one look at his face told her everything she needed to know. That bad? She asked. Worse. He dismounted and told her everything. The preemptive claims, the licensing terms, the impossible choice between fighting and losing or surrendering and losing slower. She listened without interrupting, her expression growing darker with each detail. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment, her mind clearly working through possibilities and scenarios. There might be a way, she said finally, but you're not going to like it. At this point, I'll consider anything. We expose them. Not legally, publicly. We find out who's really behind Western Territorial Development, what other projects they're involved in, what other communities they've destroyed. We build a case not in court, but in the press, make them so toxic that no one will do business with them. Margaret's already working on that. She's researching the company, trying to find vulnerabilities. I can help, Alara said. I know people in the scientific community, colleagues who've dealt with similar corporations in other territories. If Western Territorial Development has a pattern of this kind of behavior, if we can document it, we might be able to create enough public pressure to force them to back down. It was a long shot, Cole knew, but it was something. How long would that take? Days? Maybe a week if I can get telegraph responses from my contacts quickly. She met his eyes, and there was fierce determination in her expression. Cole, I let this happen once before. I won't let it happen again. Whatever it takes, we fight. The words settled between them with the weight of a vow, and Cole felt something fundamental shift in that moment. This wasn't just about saving his ranch anymore, or even about protecting the valley. It was about standing against a pattern of exploitation that had destroyed communities across the frontier, about proving that ordinary people could fight back against corporate predators who saw human suffering as profit margins. Then we fight, he said, and reached out to grip her shoulder. Together. Alara covered his hand with hers, and the contact felt electric, charged with more than just shared purpose. For a heartbeat, they stood frozen in that connection, and Cole saw in her eyes the same war he was fighting internally, the pull toward something deeper, more personal, complicated by circumstances that made any relationship feel like a dangerous distraction. She pulled away first, breaking the moment with characteristic practicality. I'll start sending telegrams tonight. There's a hydrologist in Colorado who documented Western Territorial Development's activities in the mining territories. Another in Wyoming who fought them over river rights. If I can get their testimony, their records, do it, Cole said. Whatever you need, whatever it costs, we'll find a way to pay. She disappeared into the house, already composing messages in her mind, and Cole was left alone with his thoughts and the setting sun that painted Red Hollow Valley in shades of amber and gold. The land looked peaceful from here, almost prosperous, with the green beginning to return to irrigated fields and cattle grazing contentedly near the new wells. It was hard to believe that all of this, everything they'd built, everything they'd saved, could be stolen by men in expensive suits wielding legal documents like weapons. Thomas found him there an hour later, carrying 2 glasses and a bottle of whiskey their father had been saving for a special occasion. He poured generous measures and handed one to Cole. "To fighting losing battles," Thomas said, raising his glass. "We haven't lost yet. Come on, Cole, you heard Caldwell. They've got us cornered legally, financially, every way that matters. Even if Alara finds dirt on Western Territorial Development, even if we turn public opinion against them, they can still outlast us. They've got the time and money to wait us out." Cole took a long drink, feeling the whiskey burn down his throat. "You want to give up? Accept their terms and spend the rest of our lives paying tribute to corporate thieves? I want to be realistic about our chances. We're ranchers, not lawyers or politicians. We're good at working land and raising cattle, not fighting legal warfare against people who do this for a living." Thomas stared into his glass. Maybe Dad was right. Maybe pride is just another word for stubborn stupidity. Dad also said that land worth having is land worth fighting for. He said a lot of things. Doesn't mean all of them were true. Thomas finished his whiskey in one swallow. "I'm not saying we surrender. I'm saying we need to prepare for the possibility that fighting isn't enough, that sometimes the bad guys win no matter how hard you try." Cole understood his brother's fear. He felt it himself, the gnawing doubt that whispered they were tilting at windmills, that their courage and determination meant nothing against the cold machinery of corporate law. But he also knew that if they gave in to that fear, if they accepted defeat before the battle was truly joined, they'd lose something more valuable than land or water. "You remember when we were kids," Cole said slowly, "and you fell through the ice on Miller's Pond? Everyone said you were gone, that the current had taken you under and you'd never surface. But I jumped in anyway, dove down into water so cold it felt like knives, because you were my brother and I couldn't just stand there and accept losing you." "You found me caught in the reeds," Thomas said quietly, "pulled me out half drowned. The point is, I didn't know I'd find you. The smart money was on both of us drowning, but I couldn't live with myself if I didn't try, if I let fear of failure keep me from at least attempting to save what mattered." Cole looked at his brother. "This valley, these people, they matter. Alara matters, and I'd rather drown trying to save them than stand safe on shore watching them go under." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the darkening landscape. When he spoke again, his voice was rough with emotion. "You're in love with her, aren't you? With Alara?" The statement caught Cole off guard, forcing him to confront something he'd been carefully avoiding examining too closely. "I don't know, maybe. It's complicated." "Well, love usually is. But Cole, you need to think about what that means for this fight. If we lose, she's going to blame herself again. Another valley destroyed, another community she couldn't save. And if that breaks her, it won't. She's stronger than that." "Is she?" "Because from what you've told me about Nevada, she's still carrying that failure like an open wound. Adding another one might be more than she can bear." The thought terrified Cole more than he wanted to admit. He'd seen the shadows in Alara's eyes, the guilt that drove her restless wandering, and her refusal to charge for her services. If Red Hollow fell to the same corporate greed that had destroyed the Nevada community, if her knowledge once again became the weapon used against people she was trying to help, it might shatter something essential in her. "Then we make sure we don't lose," Cole said with more confidence than he felt. "Whatever it takes, we find a way to win." The telegraph responses began arriving the next morning, carried by a breathless delivery boy who'd ridden hard from town. Alara tore into them with barely contained urgency, her eyes scanning the text while Cole and Thomas watched from across the kitchen table. "This is good," she said, reading the first message. "Doctor, Carson in Colorado confirms that Western Territorial Development used identical tactics there, preemptive filings on theoretical resources, then sweeping in once actual discovery was made. He's willing to testify if needed. And the others? Cole asked. She opened the second telegram and her expression darkened. Wyoming's more complicated. The hydrologist I contacted, Dr. Reeves, settled with Western Territorial Development under terms that included a non-disclosure agreement. He can't testify without facing legal action himself. Convenient, Thomas muttered. The third message made Alara go very still, the color draining from her face. Cole moved around the table, reading over her shoulder, and felt ice form in his stomach at what he saw. The telegram was from someone named Dr. Marcus Brennan, and the text was brief and brutal. Alara, so you're trying to play hero again. Hasn't worked out well for you so far. Western Territorial Development has deep pockets and long memory. Suggest you walk away before you get hurt. Some battles aren't worth fighting, MB. Who is Marcus Brennan? Cole asked, though he had a sinking feeling he already knew. The colleague I mentioned, Alara said, her voice hollow. The one who sold my research in Nevada. Apparently he's working for Western Territorial Development now, or has been all along. The implications crashed over Cole like a wave. If Brennan was involved, if he had access to Alara's research methods and geological surveys, he could have been the one who identified Red Hollow Valley as a potential target. The preemptive filings, the precise timing of Western Territorial Development's claims, it all made terrible sense if someone with inside knowledge had been guiding them. He used you, Thomas said, voicing what they were all thinking. Used what he learned from you to find aquifers across the territory, then helped the corporation file claims before anyone else knew the resources existed. Alara crumpled the telegram in her fist, her jaw tight with barely controlled rage. I taught him everything I knew. We worked together for 2 years, shared research, collaborated on geological surveys. I thought he believed in the same things I did, using science to help communities, to make life better for ordinary people. But he was just learning my methods so he could exploit them. Did he know about Red Hollow? Cole asked. Did you ever discuss this valley with him? I don't know. Maybe. We talked about hundreds of potential sites across the Western Territories. I had preliminary surveys that identified Red Hollow as geologically promising, but I hadn't verified them yet. She looked up at Cole, and her eyes were filled with anguish. If he did use my research to target this valley, then everything happening here is my fault. Every threat you're facing, every legal battle, it all traces back to me. No, Cole said firmly, gripping her shoulders and forcing her to meet his eyes. It traces back to him, to his greed and betrayal. You didn't do this, Alara. You didn't file false claims or send lawyers to threaten honest people. Don't take responsibility for someone else's evil. But if I hadn't been so naive, if I'd protected my research better, kept it confidential, then you wouldn't have helped anyone, Thomas interrupted. The whole point of your work is to share knowledge, to give people the tools they need to survive. You can't do that and also hoard every discovery like a miser. Brennan's the one who violated that trust, not you. Alara pulled away from Cole, wrapping her arms around herself as if fighting off a chill despite the summer heat. He's right about one thing in that telegram. Western Territorial Development has deep pockets and long memory. If they're willing to play this dirty, if they've been planning this for months or years, our chances just got a lot worse. Or better, Margaret Hendricks said from the doorway. None of them had heard her arrive, but she stood there with her traveling bag and an expression that suggested she'd been listening for a while. Because now we know who we're really fighting and how they operate, and I've got news that might just even the odds. She moved into the kitchen and spread a folder of documents across the table, pushing aside breakfast dishes to make room. The papers were dense with legal language and financial records, but Margaret's finger traced a path through them that told a damning story. Western Territorial Development Corporation is a shell company, she explained. Incorporated in Delaware, registered in Colorado, but the actual ownership is buried under 3 layers of subsidiary entities. Took me 2 days and a lot of favors, but I tracked it back to the source. Who? Cole demanded. A consortium of Eastern investors led by a man named Cyrus Whitmore, railroad baron, land speculator, and, this is the interesting part, currently under investigation by the territorial government for fraud related to mining claims in the Montana Territory. Apparently, Mr. Whitmore has a pattern of using shell corporations to file speculative claims, then selling those claims at inflated prices to actual developers who don't realize the resources were never properly verified. Alara leaned forward, her scientific mind immediately grasping the implications. He's running a claim-selling scheme. File on everything that might have value, then flip the claims for profit regardless of whether the resources actually exist. Exactly. And if we can prove that Western Territorial Development's claims on Red Hollow's aquifer were filed as part of this scheme, that they were never based on genuine geological assessment but were just speculative gambling, we might be able to get them invalidated on grounds of fraud. How do we prove that? Thomas asked. Margaret's smile was sharp. We use Dr. Brennan's own greed against him. If he's been feeding Western Territorial Development information based on stolen research, there will be a paper trail, geological surveys, water analysis reports, depth estimates, things that should have required months of fieldwork but appeared in their filings almost immediately after Alara's preliminary research was conducted. Brennan would have covered his tracks, Alara said, but there was a note of hope creeping into her voice. He's not stupid. No, but he's arrogant. Men like that always are. Margaret tapped one of the documents. I found references in Western Territorial Development's claim filings to comprehensive geological surveys conducted in 1877 for Red Hollow Valley. But according to the Territorial Survey Office, no such surveys were ever registered. Either they're lying about doing the work, or they did it using stolen research they couldn't officially acknowledge. Cole felt something like hope beginning to kindle in his chest. So we forced them to produce these surveys. In court, under oath, they either have to admit they filed fraudulent claims based on no real evidence, or they have to reveal that their evidence came from stolen research. Either way, they're exposed, Thomas added, catching on. The claims get thrown out, or Brennan gets charged with theft, or both. There's risk, Margaret cautioned. If we go this route, we're making serious accusations against powerful people. They'll fight back hard, and if we can't prove our case conclusively, we could end up facing defamation lawsuits on top of everything else. What do we need to prove it? Alara asked. Your original research notes from before you worked with Brennan. Anything that shows you identified Red Hollow as a potential aquifer site before Western Territorial Development filed their claims. If we can establish that timeline, show that they couldn't possibly have legitimate geological data supporting their filings, we've got them. Alara was already moving, pulling her leather satchel from where it hung by the door. She dug through it with frantic energy, extracting journal after journal filled with calculations, maps, and observations. Her hands shook slightly as she sorted through them, searching for specific entries. Here, she said finally, laying open a journal dated 1876. Red Hollow Valley, preliminary geological assessment based on creek bed formations and soil composition. I noted it as high probability for deep aquifer presence, recommended follow-up fieldwork pending resources and time. Margaret examined the entry carefully, checking the date stamps and comparing them to the Western Territorial Development filing dates in her documents. Her smile grew wider. Their claims were filed in March 1877, citing surveys allegedly conducted throughout 1877. But your preliminary assessment is dated November 1876, and you didn't work with Brennan until January 1877. She looked up, eyes gleaming with professional triumph. He saw your notes, realized the potential, and fed the information to Western Territorial Development before either of you had done actual fieldwork. They filed claims based on your preliminary theory, gambling that you'd eventually confirm it. Which I did, Alara said bitterly. By coming here, by finding the aquifer, I proved their speculative claims were valid. But they didn't know that when they filed, Cole interjected. They were gambling on stolen information, betting on your work without having any of their own. That's fraud. Proving fraud requires showing intent to deceive, Margaret said. But the timeline helps. If we can demonstrate that Western Territorial Development filed claims based on theoretical data, they didn't generate themselves, and that they've done this repeatedly in other territories as part of Whitmore's scheme, we can make a case for a pattern of fraudulent filing. Thomas had been studying the documents with growing excitement. What about Dr. Carson in Colorado? He testified that Western Territorial Development used the same tactics there, filed claims right after hydrologists identified potential resources. It establishes pattern, Margaret finished. Not proof of fraud in Red Hollow specifically, but strong circumstantial evidence of systematic abuse of the claim system. Combined with the timeline discrepancies and Brennan's connection to both Alara and the corporation, we might have enough to at least force a serious investigation. Investigation takes time, Cole said. Time we don't have. Caldwell gave us until the end of the week to accept their licensing terms. So we don't wait for an investigation, Alara said, and there was steel in her voice now, the guilt and fear replaced by cold determination. We take what we have directly to the newspapers. We make it public. Western Territorial Development can threaten us with lawsuits, but they can't stop the press from reporting on Cyrus Whitmore's fraud investigation in Montana, or the suspicious timing of their claims, or the fact that their geological expert has a history of stealing research from colleagues. Margaret nodded slowly. It's risky. If we can't back up everything we publish, they'll destroy us in court. But if we're careful, if we stick to verifiable facts and raise questions rather than making direct accusations, we create enough smoke that people assume fire, Thomas finished. Make them toxic enough that even if they win legally, they lose in the court of public opinion. Cole looked at each of them in turn, his brother, his lawyer, and the woman who'd become far more important to him than he'd ever intended to let happen. They were proposing to go to war with an enemy that had more resources, better legal footing, and a proven track record of crushing opposition. The smart move would be to negotiate the best terms they could, and accept that sometimes the bad guys won. But Cole Maddox hadn't dug through 60 feet of rock on the hope of finding invisible water because he believed in smart moves. He believed in stubborn faith, in fighting for what mattered even when the odds were terrible, in standing beside people who needed him even when standing meant risking everything. Do it, he said. Contact the newspapers, prepare the story, show them everything we've got. And let's make damn sure Caldwell and his employers understand that if they want a war, we're ready to give them one. The article ran in the Denver Post 3 days later, under the headline, Water Rights or Water Wrongs? Questions surround corporate claims in Red Hollow Valley. It was carefully worded, raising more questions than it answered, but the implications were devastating. The piece detailed Cyrus Whitmore's ongoing fraud investigation, described the pattern of suspicious claim filings by Western Territorial Development across multiple territories, and quoted Dr. Carson's testimony about similar tactics used in Colorado. It mentioned, almost in passing, that the corporation's geological expert had previously been accused of research theft by a colleague, though it didn't name Brennan directly, and it included heart-wrenching testimony from Sarah Miller about nearly losing everything before the community came together to save itself, only to face legal threats from outsiders who'd never set foot on the land they claimed to own. The response was immediate and explosive. Telegrams poured into Red Hollow from other communities facing similar corporate predation, offering support and sharing their own stories. Territorial politicians who'd previously ignored the valley suddenly expressed concern about the exploitation of honest ranchers. 2 competing newspapers picked up the story, each adding their own investigative reporting that uncovered additional questionable practices by Western Territorial Development. And most importantly, investors began pulling back from Cyrus Whitmore's ventures, spooked by the negative publicity and the growing scrutiny of his business practices. Harrison Caldwell appeared at the Maddox Ranch 2 days after the article's publication, arriving without his colleagues and looking considerably less polished than he had during their first meeting. His expensive suit was dusty from the ride, and there was tension in his jaw that suggested he was operating under orders he didn't particularly like. "Mr. Maddox," he said curtly, "we need to talk." Cole met him on the porch, with Alara standing just inside the doorway where she could hear but remain out of sight. "I thought we already talked. You made your offer, we declined. Seems pretty straightforward." "The situation has changed. My client is prepared to make a more reasonable proposal." "How reasonable?" Caldwell's jaw tightened further. "Western Territorial Development will withdraw all claims on Red Hollow Valley water rights in exchange for your cooperation in retracting the allegations made in the recent newspaper articles. Additionally, you'll sign a non-disparagement agreement preventing future public statements about the corporation or its business practices." It was surrender dressed up as negotiation, Cole realized. The publicity had hurt them badly enough that they were willing to abandon Red Hollow to stop the bleeding, but they wanted silence in return, to make sure no one else learned the lessons of how to fight back successfully. "No," Cole said simply. Caldwell blinked. "You're refusing?" "Mr. Maddox, we're offering to give you everything you wanted. The water rights, the freedom from legal action, the ability to continue your cooperative without interference, in exchange for our silence. For agreeing to pretend this never happened, to let you try the same tactics on other communities who won't know any better because we're not allowed to warn them." Cole shook his head. "We didn't fight this hard just to abandon everyone else facing the same threat." "Be reasonable," Caldwell said, and there was frustration in his voice now. "You're ranchers, not crusaders. You wanted to protect your land. We're offering you that protection. Why complicate it with principles that don't benefit you?" "Because principles are all we've got," Ilara said, stepping out onto the porch. "They're what separate us from people like you and Cyrus Whitmore and Marcus Brennan. You see communities as profit opportunities. We see them as worth protecting, even when protection costs us something." Caldwell looked at her with recognition. "Dr. Quinn, I presume. My client was curious if you'd be involved in this matter. Dr. Brennan sends his regards, by the way." "I'm sure he does," Ilara said coldly. "Tell him I said he can go to hell, and take Western Territorial Development with him." "That's unfortunate," Caldwell said, though he didn't sound particularly surprised. "Because my client has authorized me to make one final offer, specifically addressing your involvement. If you agree to leave Red Hollow Valley and cease all hydrological work in territories where Western Territorial Development has active interests, they're prepared to drop all claims here and provide a generous financial settlement for your cooperation." The offer hung in the air like poison, and Cole felt rage building in his chest. They were trying to buy Ilara off, to remove her from the equation by offering money and the freedom to work elsewhere. It was cruel and calculated, exploiting her guilt over Nevada and her desire to help communities while simultaneously removing her ability to do so in places where she might interfere with corporate interests. "Get off my land," Cole said quietly, but his voice carried enough menace that Caldwell actually took a step back. "Get off my land and tell your client that Red Hollow Valley isn't for sale. Not the water, not our silence, and especially not the people who helped save us. We're done negotiating." "You're making a mistake," Caldwell warned. "My client has been patient, tried to be reasonable. But there are other ways to handle this situation, methods that don't require your cooperation or consent." "Is that a threat?" "It's a statement of fact. Western Territorial Development has significant resources and very little patience for being publicly embarrassed." "If you continue down this path, then we continue," Cole interrupted. "And every step of the way, we make sure people know exactly what you're doing and why. You want to fight us? Fine. But it's going to be a very public fight, and I guarantee you'll lose a lot more than you'll gain." Caldwell stared at him for a long moment, seeming to measure the resolve he saw there. Finally, he nodded curtly, gathered his papers, and walked back to his horse. "You'll regret this," he said before mounting. "Both of you." They watched him ride away in silence, and Cole felt the weight of what they'd just done settling over him. They'd rejected a settlement that would have given them everything they'd been fighting for, turned down financial security for Ilara, and guaranteed that Western Territorial Development would come at them with everything they had. It was possibly the most reckless decision he'd ever made. "We could have taken it," Ilara said quietly. "Could have accepted the deal, protected the valley, and walked away clean." "Could have," Cole agreed. "But then what? Let them do this to the next community, and the one after that, because we were too concerned with our own safety to stand up? Standing up might cost us everything." "Probably will," Cole said, "but at least we'll lose knowing we fought for something bigger than ourselves." Ilara turned to look at him, and there was something vulnerable in her expression, something that stripped away all the careful defenses she usually maintained. "Why are you doing this? You could have saved your ranch, paid off your debts, secured your future. Instead, you're risking it all to fight a battle that isn't even yours." "It became mine the moment they threatened my community," Cole said. "And it became personal the moment they tried to buy you off, like you were just another asset to be acquired." "Cole, I'm in love with you," he said, the words tumbling out before he could stop them, before he could think about timing or appropriateness or any of the 100 reasons he should have kept his mouth shut. I think I have been since you looked at my dying land and told me there was hope beneath the surface. And watching them try to drive you away, try to silence you with money and threats, it made me realize I'd rather lose everything fighting beside you than win by letting you go. Alara stared at him, her eyes wide with shock and something that might have been fear. You don't mean that. You're caught up in the moment, in the adrenaline of the fight. I mean it, Cole said firmly. And I know the timing is terrible. I know we're in the middle of a war we might not win. I know there are 1,000 reasons this is a bad idea. But I'm done pretending I don't feel this, that you're just someone who helped me find water and nothing more. I'm broken, Alara said, her voice cracking. I'm running from failures you don't even know about, carrying guilt that wakes me up at night, and I have no idea how to be what you need me to be. I don't need you to be anything except yourself, Cole said. Broken, guilty, brilliant, stubborn, I'll take all of it, because you're the strongest person I've ever met. And the fact that you keep fighting despite your scars just makes me love you more. She was crying now, tears streaming down her face, and Cole realized he'd never seen her truly cry before. Not from frustration or fear, but from the overwhelming emotion of being seen completely and accepted anyway. I don't know how to do this, she whispered. I don't know how to let someone in when everything I touch seems to fall apart. Then we'll figure it out together, Cole said, stepping closer. After we win this fight, after we save the valley and prove that good people can stand up to corporate greed, we'll figure out what comes next. But Alara, I need you to know that whatever happens, I'm not walking away. Not from this fight, and not from you. She closed the distance between them and kissed him, fierce and desperate and trembling with emotion. Cole wrapped his arms around her, feeling her heart pounding against his chest, tasting salt from her tears, and understanding in that moment that he'd just committed himself to something far more terrifying than fighting corporations or risking his ranch. He'd committed himself to loving a woman who believed she destroyed everything she tried to save, to proving her wrong through action and patience and stubborn faith. It was possibly an even more impossible task than finding water in a drought, but he was willing to try. Because some things were worth fighting for, even when the odds were terrible and the outcome uncertain. And Alara Quinn, broken and brilliant and running from ghosts, was worth every risk he could imagine. When they finally pulled apart, both breathless and shaken, the sun had dipped below the ridge, and the valley was painted in twilight purple. Cole kept his hands on Alara's waist, reluctant to break the contact completely, while she rested her forehead against his chest and tried to steady her breathing. This complicates everything, she said, but there was no real regret in her voice. Everything was already complicated, Cole replied. At least now we're complicated together. She laughed, the sound slightly watery but genuine, and looked up at him with eyes that were clearer than he'd ever seen them. The shadows were still there, the guilt and fear and accumulated scars of past failures, but there was also something new. Hope, perhaps, or the beginning of belief that maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to carry her burdens alone anymore. We should go inside, she said reluctantly. Thomas will be back soon, and we need to prepare for whatever Western territorial development throws at us next. Caldwell wasn't bluffing about other methods. Cole nodded, though he didn't immediately move. Alara, I meant what I said. All of it. Whatever comes next, we face it together. I know, she said quietly, and that terrifies me almost as much as it gives me hope. They walked back into the house hand in hand, and Cole felt something fundamental settle into place inside him. He'd spent his entire adult life defined by the land, by the legacy his father and grandfather had built, by the weight of expectation and duty that came with being a Maddox. But standing here with Alara, preparing to fight a battle that might cost him everything, he realized that land and legacy meant nothing without someone to share them with. The ranch was worth saving because it represented community, cooperation, the stubborn refusal to let greed triumph over human decency. And all of that was embodied in the woman beside him who'd risked her own safety to help strangers fight impossible odds. Thomas arrived an hour later with news that confirmed Caldwell's implied threats. 2 ranches on the eastern edge of the valley had received visits from men claiming to represent a surveying company, asking questions about water usage and well depths. When pressed, they'd become evasive about who employed them and what their actual purpose was. They're gathering intelligence, Margaret Hendricks said when they convened an emergency meeting at the church that night. trying to find weaknesses they can exploit, maybe identify ranchers who might be willing to break from the cooperative in exchange for private deals. Should we be worried about that? Bill Patterson asked. About people taking individual settlements? Everyone in this room has a right to make their own choices, Cole said carefully. If Western Territorial Development offers someone terms they can live with, I'm not going to judge them for accepting. We're all doing our best to survive. But if enough people break ranks, Marcus Webb pointed out, the cooperative falls apart and the rest of us are vulnerable. Unity is our only real strength against corporate money and legal expertise. The murmur of agreement that rippled through the assembled crowd told Cole that most people understood this. They'd seen what cooperation could accomplish: wells dug, land restored, hope rekindled from the edge of despair. Breaking that unity now would be surrendering everything they'd built together. We need to make a decision as a group, Sarah Miller said, standing up with her youngest child on her hip. Are we committed to this fight all the way, even if it gets ugly? Because I need to know that when the pressure increases, when they start making individual offers or threats, we'll stand together. My family can't survive another collapse. I'm in, James Hendricks said immediately. All the way. They want this valley, they'll have to go through every last one of us. Others began adding their voices. Patterson and his sons, the Webb family, the Johnsons, the Millers, all the smaller ranchers who'd barely survived the drought and now faced a different kind of predator. One by one, they committed themselves to collective resistance, to protecting not just their individual properties, but the community itself. When the meeting ended 2 hours later, they had a pact signed by 23 families pledging mutual support and shared sacrifice in the face of corporate aggression. It was a powerful symbol, one that Margaret promised to include in their next round of newspaper articles to demonstrate that Red Hollow Valley wasn't just defending water rights, they were defending a way of life. But symbols didn't stop men with guns. The attack came 3 nights later, swift and brutal and designed to send a message that legal niceties were over. Cole was awakened by the sound of breaking glass and Thomas shouting from downstairs. He grabbed his rifle from beside the bed and was halfway down the stairs when he saw orange light flickering through the broken kitchen window. Fire. Someone had thrown burning bottles through the windows, and flames were already spreading across the wooden floor with terrifying speed. Thomas was beating at them with a blanket while Ilara threw water from the kitchen basin, but it was clear they were losing ground. "Get out!" Cole shouted. "The whole house is going to go up." They stumbled out into the yard just as the roof caught, flames erupting into the night sky with a roar that sounded like rage itself. Cole watched his family home. 3 generations of Maddox history, the place where he'd been born and raised and planned to die, being consumed by fire set by men too cowardly to show their faces. In the distance, he could see more fires. The Patterson Ranch, glowing orange against the darkness. The Miller place, smoke rising in thick columns. Someone was systematically targeting cooperative members, trying to break their will through destruction and terror. "The wells," Ilara gasped, coughing from the smoke. "They'll go after the wells next." She was right. If the goal was maximum devastation, destroying the water sources would be the coup de grace. Everything they'd built, all the hope they'd rekindled, could be poisoned or collapsed in a single night of violence. "Thomas, get to town," Cole ordered. "Wake up everyone you can, get them armed and protecting their wells. I'm going to the Miller place." "I'm coming with you," Ilara said, and her voice left no room for argument. They rode hard through the darkness, and Cole felt a cold fury building in his chest that was somehow worse than the fear. This wasn't legal maneuvering or corporate pressure. This was terrorism, pure and simple. An attempt to break the community's spirit through violence because Western Territorial Development had lost the moral and public relations battle. The Miller Ranch was chaos when they arrived. The barn was fully engulfed, and Ben Miller was running back and forth trying to save his few remaining cattle while Sarah herded the children to safety. Cole and Ilara helped evacuate the animals, then turned their attention to the well, which so far appeared untouched. "They'll be back," Ben said, his face streaked with soot and desperation. "Whoever did this, they'll come back to finish the job." "Not if we're waiting for them," Cole replied grimly. He positioned himself near the well with his rifle, and Ilara stayed close despite his protests that she should find somewhere safer. "I'm not hiding while you fight," she said flatly. "We're in this together, remember?" The arsonists returned an hour before dawn, 3 men on horseback carrying bottles and torches. They clearly expected to find the property abandoned or its occupants too terrified to resist. What they found instead was Cole Maddox standing in the open with a rifle aimed directly at them. "That's far enough," Cole called out. "Drop your weapons and turn around, or I start shooting." The lead rider laughed, a harsh sound that carried across the distance. "You're one man with one rifle. There's 3 of us and more coming. Smart thing would be to stand aside." "Smart thing would be for you to leave before you get hurt," Cole countered. "This valley isn't for sale, and it's not for burning. Whatever Western Territorial Development is paying you, it's not enough to die for." "Big words from a man who's about to lose everything," the rider said. But there was uncertainty in his voice now, a hesitation that suggested he'd expected an easy job and was finding something more complicated. The standoff might have escalated into violence if not for the sound of approaching horses, dozens of them, riding hard from the direction of town. The arsonist turned to see James Hendricks leading what looked like half the valley, every man armed and angry and done with being terrorized. The 3 riders exchanged glances, made a quick calculation about odds they didn't like, and spurred their horses into retreat. They disappeared into the pre-dawn darkness, leaving behind their bottles and a clear message that Red Hollow Valley wasn't going to be intimidated into submission. Hendricks reined in beside Cole, breathing hard from the ride. "Thomas got word to everyone. We've got armed men posted at every well, every ranch house. They want a war. We'll give them one." "This is what they wanted," Ilara said, her voice tight with frustration. "To provoke us into violence, to make us look like the aggressors instead of the victims. Every newspaper story about corporate greed gets overshadowed if we start shooting people, justified or not." She was right, Cole realized. Western Territorial Development had lost the public relations battle, so they were trying to change the battlefield entirely. If Red Hollow Valley responded with violence, even defensive violence, the narrative would shift from innocent ranchers versus corporate bullies to lawless, frontier vigilantes creating chaos. "So what do we do?" Ben Miller demanded. "Let them burn us out? Watch our homes and livelihoods go up in smoke while we worry about newspaper coverage?" "We defend ourselves," Cole said. "But we also document everything, every fire, every threat, every act of violence. We collect evidence, identify the arsonists if we can, and we make damn sure the world knows who's really responsible for this." It was Margaret who provided the solution. She arrived at first light with a photographer she'd hired from Denver, a lean man named Samuel Chen who'd made a name for himself documenting injustices across the frontier. Together, they spent the next 2 days photographing the burned buildings, interviewing victims, and collecting testimony about the attacks. The images Chen captured were devastating in their stark honesty. Sarah Miller standing in front of her ruined barn with her children clinging to her skirts, their faces smudged with soot and fear. Ben Miller staring at the ashes of everything he'd built, his expression hollow with shock. The Maddox ranch house reduced to a blackened skeleton, 3 generations of family history transformed into charcoal and memory. But Chen also photographed the community's response. Armed men standing guard at the wells, refusing to be driven off. Neighbors helping neighbors rebuild, sharing resources and labor despite their own losses. Children playing near the water sources their parents had fought so hard to protect, oblivious to the darkness that had tried to destroy their futures. The resulting article ran in newspapers across the territory with a headline that made Western Territorial Development's leadership furious. "Corporate terror in Red Hollow, when legal battles turned to arson." The images were reproduced in a dozen publications, showing the human cost of corporate greed in ways that legal documents and financial reports never could. Public outrage was immediate and intense. Politicians who'd previously been silent suddenly demanded investigations. Territorial marshals were dispatched to Red Hollow to maintain order and investigate the attacks. And most importantly, investors continued fleeing from anything associated with Cyrus Whitmore and Western Territorial Development. The corporation tried to deny involvement, claiming the attacks were the work of random criminals unconnected to their legal dispute. But Margaret had done her homework. She'd traced payments from Western Territorial Development to a security firm that employed 2 of the men spotted at the Miller Ranch. She'd found telegrams between Whitmore and his lieutenants discussing alternative pressure tactics and discouraging continued resistance. The evidence wasn't conclusive enough for criminal charges. Whitmore's lawyers had been too careful for that, But it was damning enough for the court of public opinion. Western territorial development became toxic overnight, their name synonymous with corporate overreach and criminal violence. 3 weeks after the attacks, Harrison Caldwell returned to Red Hollow for the final time. He looked like a man who'd been beaten thoroughly and knew it. His expensive suit somehow diminished, his earlier arrogance replaced by weary resignation. "My client has authorized me to make a final offer," he said, meeting with Cole, Margaret, and Alara in what was left of the Maddox ranch house. They sat on salvaged chairs amid the ruins, a deliberately chosen setting that forced Caldwell to confront the destruction his employers had caused. Western Territorial Development will withdraw all claims on Red Hollow Valley water rights with no conditions, no requirements for silence, and no future legal action. In exchange, you agree not to pursue civil damages for the property destruction and personal harm caused during the recent incidents. "That's it?" Cole asked skeptically. "They walk away clean, we get the water, and nobody pays for the attacks?" "The alternative is continued litigation that will cost both sides considerable resources and likely end with the same result, given the current political and public relations environment. My client recognizes that continued involvement in Red Hollow Valley is untenable." Margaret studied the proposed agreement with the lawyer's careful attention. "What about other territories? Other communities facing similar tactics?" Caldwell hesitated. "That's outside the scope of this negotiation." "Make it inside the scope," Alara said coldly. Western Territorial Development agrees to drop all speculative water rights claims filed based on unverified geological data. They commit to only filing claims on resources they've personally surveyed and confirmed, and they establish a fund to compensate communities that have already been damaged by their previous tactics. "That's impossible. My client would never agree to those terms." "Then we'll see you in court," Cole said, "and we'll make sure every newspaper in the territory covers every day of the trial. We'll bring in Dr. Carson from Colorado. We'll document every shady claim Whitmore's corporations have filed, and we'll spend the next 5 years making Western Territorial Development the most hated company in the West." Caldwell looked at them for a long moment, seeming to measure their resolve and finding it absolute. "I'll convey your terms to my client, but I can tell you now that he won't accept them." "Then convey this too," Margaret said. "We've been contacted by 3 other communities facing similar situations. They want to know how we fought back, what tactics worked, how to organize resistance. Red Hollow Valley isn't just about water anymore. It's become a blueprint for fighting corporate predation. The longer Western Territorial Development drags this out, the more that blueprint spreads. Eventually, they won't be able to operate anywhere without facing organized, informed opposition." Understanding flickered across Caldwell's face. He'd been sent to negotiate the surrender of one valley, but he was facing something bigger, the birth of a movement that could threaten his client's entire business model. Every day Western Territorial Development remained entangled with Red Hollow was another day for other communities to learn, organize, and prepare their own defenses. "I'll convey your terms," he said again, and this time there was no skepticism in his voice, just resignation. He left without another word, and Cole watched him go with a sense of surreal victory. They'd done it. Against impossible odds, with nothing but determination and the willingness to fight for what mattered, they'd brought a powerful corporation to its knees. "Do you think Whitmore will accept the terms?" Thomas asked. He'd been listening from the doorway, and his expression was cautiously hopeful. "He doesn't have a choice," Margaret said. "His investors are fleeing, his other ventures are being scrutinized, and continuing to fight us just makes everything worse. He'll accept, though he'll probably try to negotiate the compensation fund down to something more manageable." "We'll compromise on the amount but not the principle," Alara said. "Other communities deserve restitution for what's been done to them. That's non-negotiable." The final settlement was reached 2 weeks later. Western Territorial Development withdrew all claims on Red Hollow Valley's aquifer with no strings attached. They agreed to audit their existing water rights claims across 5 territories and drop any that couldn't be verified through legitimate geological surveys. And they established a compensation fund of $20,000 to be distributed among communities that could prove harm from the corporation's previous tactics. It wasn't everything they'd wanted, but it was a genuine victory, not just for Red Hollow, but for the principle that ordinary people could stand up to corporate greed and win. The celebration that night was bittersweet. They'd saved the valley and set important precedents, but the cost had been high. Several families had lost homes and barns to the arson attacks. The community had exhausted their resources fighting battles on multiple fronts, and while they'd won the war, the scars it left would take years to heal. Cole stood at the site where his family home had stood, looking at the foundation that was all that remained. Thomas joined him, and for a while they just stood in silence, mourning what had been lost while acknowledging what they'd gained. "We could rebuild here," Thomas said finally. "Same spot, same layout. Make it exactly like it was." "We could," Cole agreed. "Or we could build something new. Something that honors the past but doesn't try to recreate it." Thomas nodded slowly, understanding what his brother meant. The old Maddox Ranch, built on independence and individual strength, had almost died with the drought. What had saved them was cooperation, community, the willingness to share burdens and victories alike. A new house should reflect that new reality. "What are you thinking?" Thomas asked. "Something bigger. Room for family, yes, but also space for meetings, for gatherings. A place where the cooperative can come together, where decisions get made collectively." Cole smiled slightly. "And a dedicated office for our resident hydrologist, since I'm hoping she'll be staying permanently." "You haven't asked her yet?" "Haven't found the right moment. We've been too busy fighting for survival to talk about futures." "You should ask her soon," Thomas advised, "before she starts thinking too hard about all the reasons leaving might be easier than staying." Cole knew his brother was right. Alara had stayed through the worst of it, had fought beside them, and risked her own safety for people she'd only known a few months. But the battle was over now, and nothing tied her to Red Hollow except a relationship that was still new and uncertain. If he wanted her to stay, and he desperately did, he needed to give her a reason beyond shared trauma and recent victory. He found her that evening at the second well, the one they dug together when everything still seemed impossible. She was taking measurements, documenting flow rates and water quality with the meticulous attention to detail that characterized all her work. "Building a record for the cooperative," she explained when she noticed him watching. "If other communities want to replicate what you've done here, they'll need detailed information about sustainable extraction rates, seasonal variations, long-term aquifer health. I want to make sure they have everything they need to succeed." "That sounds like work that could take years," Cole said carefully. "It could," Alara agreed, not quite meeting his eyes. "Or I could train someone local to continue the monitoring, leave them with protocols and methodologies, and move on to the next valley that needs help." "Is that what you want to do? Move on?" She set down her instruments and finally looked at him directly. "I don't know what I want anymore. A month ago, I would have said I wanted to keep moving, to help as many communities as possible before my past caught up with me again. But now I'm terrified," she admitted, "because I want to stay. I want to build something here, with you, with this community. But every time I've let myself want something, every time I've let myself believe I could have a home, it's fallen apart. Nevada, Colorado, all the places I tried to help that ended in failure or betrayal. What if Red Hollow is just another temporary stop? What if I stay and everything crumbles again?" Cole moved closer, taking her hands in his. "What if it doesn't? What if you stay and we build something that lasts? A real research center for studying aquifer systems, for teaching other hydrologists your methods, for helping communities across the frontier learn to find and protect their own water sources. You wouldn't just be helping one valley, you'd be creating a legacy that could transform the entire region." "That's a beautiful dream," Alara said, and there were tears in her eyes. "But dreams require faith, and I'm not sure I have that anymore." "Then borrow mine," Cole said. "I have faith enough for both of us. Faith that you're stronger than your past failures. Faith that what we've built here together is real and worth protecting. Faith that you deserve to stop running and start living." "I don't know how to do that. How to stop running?" "You start by making a choice," Cole said gently. "You decide that this is where you belong, that these are your people, that this land is worth investing yourself in completely. And then you take it one day at a time, building something permanent out of temporary victories." Alara was quiet for a long moment, her eyes searching his face for something she seemed desperate to find. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Ask me. Whatever you're building up to, whatever question you've been afraid to pose, ask me now before I lose my nerve." Cole took a breath, feeling the weight of the moment. understanding that what he said next would determine not just his future, but hers as well. Stay with me, not as a hired expert or a temporary ally, but as my partner in everything. Help me rebuild the ranch, expand the cooperative, create something that matters. Marry me, Alara Quinn, and let's prove together that broken people can build beautiful things. The proposal hung between them like a fragile promise, and Cole watched emotions flicker across Alara's face. Fear, hope, longing, doubt, all warring for dominance. He'd laid himself bare, risked rejection, and now all he could do was wait for her answer. "Yes," she said finally, and the word came out like a confession, like a leap of faith off a cliff into unknown waters. "Yes, I'll stay. Yes, I'll marry you. Yes to all of it, even though I'm terrified and uncertain and have no idea how to be someone's partner when I've spent years running alone." Cole pulled her close and kissed her, tasting salt from her tears and feeling her trembling in his arms. It was a kiss that promised nothing except shared struggle and mutual commitment, but somehow that was enough. More than enough. When they finally pulled apart, Alara laughed shakily. "We're either very brave or very foolish." "Definitely both," Cole agreed, "but we're both together, and that makes all the difference." The rebuilding of Red Hollow Valley happened faster than anyone expected. The compensation fund from Western Territorial Development provided seed money that the cooperative used to purchase equipment and materials. Families worked together to raise new barns and houses, incorporating lessons learned from the fire about fire-resistant construction and better spacing between structures. The Maddox Ranch was rebuilt as Cole had envisioned, larger, designed for community use with a dedicated wing that became the Red Hollow Valley Water Research Center. Alara took charge of the center, documenting everything they'd learned about deep well drilling, aquifer management, and sustainable extraction. She corresponded with hydrologists across the territory, sharing knowledge freely and helping other communities avoid the pitfalls she'd experienced. Dr. Carson from Colorado visited in the spring of 1879 and stayed for 3 months, working with Alara to formalize methodologies and training protocols. Together, they began teaching courses for anyone who wanted to learn, ranchers looking to protect their own resources, territorial surveyors seeking better techniques, even a few young people who discovered they had aptitude for the scientific work of reading the earth. The cooperative flourished, expanding beyond just water rights to include shared equipment, collective purchasing of supplies, and mutual support systems that made every member ranch stronger. They began selling surplus water to surrounding territories, generating revenue that was reinvested in infrastructure and community development. Sarah Miller's husband Ben found new purpose in the cooperative's expansion, using his organizational skills to coordinate sales and distribution. The Patterson family became expert well diggers, hiring out their services across the territory and building a reputation for reliable, efficient work. Marcus Webb, despite his initial skepticism, became one of the cooperative's strongest advocates, traveling to other valleys to share the Red Hollow story and encourage similar organizing efforts. Newspapers continued to follow the Red Hollow Valley story, chronicling their transformation from drought-stricken dying community to thriving cooperative model. Articles appeared in Eastern publications, and Cole found himself fielding questions from economists and social reformers who saw in Red Hollow a blueprint for alternative economic structures. It was overwhelming and exhausting and deeply satisfying in ways he'd never anticipated. Cole and Alara were married in September of 1879, exactly 1 year after the bank's final deadline that had seemed so insurmountable. The wedding was held at the second well, the one they dug together when everything still felt impossible, and every family in the cooperative attended. Ben Miller officiated, his voice strong and clear in a way it hadn't been since before the drought, and Sarah Miller cried through the entire ceremony while her children fidgeted and whispered. Thomas served as best man, and Margaret Hendricks stood with Alara, the two women having developed a friendship based on mutual respect and shared battles. When Cole kissed his bride, the assembled crowd erupted in cheers and applause that echoed across the valley, a sound of pure joy from people who'd earned the right to celebrate. The reception lasted until dawn, with music and dancing and storytelling that became more elaborate with each retelling. James Hendricks recounted the first time they'd struck water, embellishing Cole's stoic determination into heroic legend. Bill Patterson described the night they'd faced down the arsonists, turning a tense standoff into an epic battle of good versus evil. Even Marcus Webb contributed a grudging admission that maybe, just maybe, cooperation worked better than rugged individualism. As the sun rose over Red Hollow Valley, painting the landscape in shades of gold and amber, Cole stood with his wife and watched the land that had almost killed him transform into something beautiful. The wells they'd dug were flowing strong and steady. The fields were green with crops that would have been impossible 2 years ago. Cattle grazed peacefully, their numbers rebuilt and growing. And everywhere he looked, he saw evidence of community. Neighbors helping neighbors, children playing together, families building futures on land that belonged to them collectively. "We did it," Alara said softly, leaning against him. "We actually did it." "We did," Cole agreed, "but it's not finished. This is just the beginning." "I know. There are still other valleys that need help. Other communities facing similar threats. The work never really ends." "No," Cole said, "but at least now we're doing it together." Alara smiled, that rare, genuine expression that still had the power to make his heart race. "Together," she echoed. "I think I'm finally starting to understand what that means." In the years that followed, Red Hollow Valley became a destination for communities across the Western Territories seeking to learn from their success. The cooperative model was replicated in dozens of locations, adapted to local conditions but built on the same principles of mutual support and shared resources that had saved Red Hollow. Alara's research center attracted students and scientists from across the country, becoming a hub for hydrological study and innovation. She published papers that revolutionized understanding of aquifer systems, but she also made sure that knowledge remained accessible to ordinary people who needed it most. Every technique she developed, every discovery she made, was freely shared with communities that could benefit. Cole served as the cooperative's elected leader for 3 terms before stepping down to focus on ranching and raising the family he and Alara were building. 2 daughters and a son, all born to the sound of flowing water and raised in a community that valued cooperation over competition, contribution over accumulation. Thomas eventually married Sarah Miller after her husband Ben passed peacefully in his sleep, worn out by years of hard living but content with what he'd built. The combined families worked the Miller Ranch together, continuing to expand the cooperative's reach and influence. Marcus Brennan, the colleague who'd betrayed Alara in Nevada, tried to file new water rights claims in Arizona Territory 5 years later, and found himself facing organized resistance from communities that had learned from Red Hollow's example. His reputation destroyed and his schemes exposed, he disappeared from the frontier entirely, last heard of working as a surveyor for a railroad company back east. Cyrus Whitmore's empire collapsed under the weight of fraud investigations and investor exodus. Western territorial development was dissolved, its assets sold off to pay creditors and settlements to damaged communities. Whitmore himself fled to Europe to avoid prosecution, leaving behind a legacy of greed and destruction that served as a cautionary tale for a generation. Franklin Garrison, the banker who'd nearly foreclosed on the Maddox Ranch, ended up partnering with the cooperative to establish a credit union that financed well drilling and infrastructure projects across the territory. He claimed he'd always believed in community banking and conveniently forgot his earlier role in threatening the valley's survival. The drought that had nearly destroyed Red Hollow Valley finally broke in the winter of 1880, bringing rains that filled the surface streams and replenished shallow wells. But by then, the valley had learned to survive without depending on rainfall alone. The deep wells continued flowing regardless of surface conditions, providing security and stability that weather could never threaten. On a warm afternoon in the summer of 1885, Cole stood at the same ridge where he'd once contemplated losing everything and looked down at Red Hollow Valley transformed. Where he'd once seen dying cattle and cracked earth, he now saw prosperity and permanence. The valley held over 40 ranches, all part of the cooperative, supporting more than 200 families. The town of Red Hollow had tripled in size, with new businesses and even a small college built around Alara's research center. His oldest daughter, Catherine, was 12 now, and showing an aptitude for geology that reminded him painfully of her mother. She'd already announced her intention to study hydrological science, to follow in Alara's footsteps and help communities across the frontier find their own salvation beneath the surface. His son Samuel was 8 and obsessed with cattle ranching, spending every spare moment with the herds and learning the business that had sustained the Maddox family for 3 generations. He had Thomas's practical nature and Cole's stubborn determination, a combination that suggested he'd make a fine rancher someday. And little Margaret, named for the lawyer who'd fought beside them and saved their legal case, was only 4 but already displaying a fierce independence that promised interesting teenage years ahead. Alara joined him on the ridge, having ridden up from the research center where she'd been teaching a class on aquifer mapping. She was 37 now, with silver beginning to thread through her dark hair and laugh lines around her eyes that hadn't been there when she'd first arrived in Red Hollow. She looked more settled, more at peace, the haunted expression that had defined her for so long replaced by quiet contentment. "Thinking big thoughts?" she asked, settling beside him on the stone outcropping that had become his favorite contemplation spot. "Thinking about how far we've come, about all the things that had to go right for us to be here now. Or all the things that went wrong that forced us to find a better way," Alara countered. "The drought, the corporate threats, the attacks, they were all terrible, but they pushed us to build something stronger than what existed before. You think we would have created the cooperative without all that pressure?" "No," Alara said honestly. "People don't usually choose radical change when the status quo is comfortable. It takes crisis to force innovation, suffering to inspire solidarity. We paid a high price for what we built, but maybe that's what makes it valuable. Easy victories don't last. Hard-won ones become foundations." Cole thought about that, about the blood and sweat and tears they'd invested in transforming Red Hollow Valley from dying to thriving. She was right that the cost had been high, but the return had been worth it. They'd created something that would outlast them, a legacy built not on individual achievement, but on collective strength. "Do you ever regret staying?" he asked. "Ever wonder what you could have accomplished if you'd kept moving, helped more communities instead of settling in one place?" "Every day," Alara admitted, and Cole's heart clenched before she continued. "But then I remember that helping one community deeply is often more valuable than helping many communities shallowly. Red Hollow didn't just survive, it became a model. Every valley that's learned from our example, every cooperative that's formed using principles we established, every well that's been dug using techniques I developed here, they're all extensions of the choice I made to stay. I've probably helped more people by staying than I ever could have by leaving." "And what about us?" Cole asked quietly. "Do you regret choosing me over continued wandering?" Alara turned to look at him directly, her steel-gray eyes clear and certain. "Cole Maddox, you saved my life. Not by pulling me from physical danger, but by giving me a reason to stop running from my past and start building a future. You saw me at my most broken and convinced me I was worth putting back together. I could never regret that, no matter what else happened." He kissed her then, tasting joy and gratitude in the comfortable intimacy of years spent learning each other's rhythms and vulnerabilities. When they pulled apart, the sun was beginning its descent toward evening, painting the valley in the colors of promise fulfilled. "We should head back," Alara said. "Catherine wanted to show me her latest geological survey of the southern ridge, and I promised Samuel I'd help him calculate grazing rotation schedules. And Margaret is probably trying to convince Thomas to let her ride the biggest horse in the stable, completely ignoring the fact that her legs don't reach the stirrups yet." Cole laughed, imagining his youngest daughter's determination and his brother's patient exasperation. They rode back down into the valley together, toward the home they'd built from ashes and impossible hope, toward the children they were raising to value cooperation over competition, toward the community that had saved itself by choosing to stand together. Red Hollow Valley would face other challenges in the years ahead. Droughts would come again, markets would fluctuate, new threats would emerge from directions they couldn't predict. But the foundation they'd built, of mutual support, shared resources, and collective strength, would endure. And at the heart of it all was a simple truth that Cole had learned through desperation and vindicated through survival. Some fights were worth having, even when the odds were terrible. Some people were worth standing beside, even when standing meant risking everything. And some loves were worth building a life around, even when that life required constant work and unwavering faith. The sun set over Red Hollow Valley, painting the sky in shades of amber and crimson, and Cole Maddox rode home beside the woman who'd taught him to see invisible rivers flowing beneath the surface. Behind them stretched land that had almost died but instead had been reborn. Ahead lay years of work and challenge and the daily miracle of building something permanent in an impermanent world. It was enough. More than enough. It was everything.